Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Get comfortable, because tonight we're stepping into the everyday world of Tudor England to discover how ordinary people lived, worked, ate, and found comfort in their daily lives. Before we start tonight, if these slow journeys through history have become part of your evenings, leaving a like and subscribing is a wonderful way to help this little channel find someone else who needs it too. It costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. And if you have a moment, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Maybe it's a quiet evening in Ohio, a peaceful cottage somewhere in the Lake District, or a cool night in the Hunter Valley. Leave me a comment if you feel like it. I do read every single one. All right, love. Are you comfortable? Good. Let us begin. The bread has to go in before first light, and Robert Baldwin knows this the way he knows his own name without having to think about it, because he has done it every working day for 11 years. It is a small stone house on the edge of a wool town in Suffolk, the kind of place where the smell of the river never quite leaves the air, and Robert is not the baker, though flour dust does cling to his sleeves some mornings when he helps his brother-in-law at the ovens. Robert is a weaver. Broadcloth mostly, the heavy woolen fabric that gets shipped down to London and out across the sea to places he will never see and cannot really picture, though he tries sometimes, lying awake, wondering what a Flemish merchant's warehouse looks like, whether the cloth he made with his own hands is folded there right now under a foreign roof. His wife's name is Joan, and she is already awake before him most mornings, which he finds a little embarrassing if he is honest, though he has never said so aloud. She keeps the house, yes, that is the plain word for it, but the word does not carry the weight of what it actually means. Brewing the morning ale, coaxing the fire back from its embers, checking on the hens before the fox does. Joan Baldwin does more before 6 in the morning than most people today do in an entire day, and she has never once thought of it as remarkable. It is simply Tuesday. It is simply Thursday. It is simply the shape her life has taken, the way water takes the shape of whatever holds it. Their daughter Alison is 15 this year, old enough now to be trusted with the spinning wheel for hours at a stretch, old enough that her mother has started watching her a little differently at church, the way mothers do when a daughter is edging toward the age where the whole shape of her future is about to be decided by people other than herself. Alison does not know yet what her mother has noticed. She only knows that lately she has been finding excuses to walk past the tanner's stall on market days, and that she could not honestly tell you why. The house itself is small by the standards you might be picturing, if you're picturing a Tudor house at all right now, one of those tall black and white buildings leaning out over a cobbled street, the kind you see on the front of a chocolate box or a tourist postcard. This is not that. This is a single ground floor room with a loft above it reached by a ladder, walls made of timber frame packed with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven hazel strips and a thick daub of clay, straw and sometimes even animal dung, though nobody thinks of it that way once it has dried and been lime-washed white. The floor is packed earth, swept so often and so thoroughly that it has taken on something close to a polish. There is one proper window, small, high, with a wooden shutter rather than glass, because glass is still a luxury even now, in the middle of the 16th century, something you would find in a wealthy merchant's house, or a church, not in the home of a weaver and his family. And here is the thing that always surprises people when I tell it to them. This house, plain as it sounds, humble as it sounds, was actually a step up from how Robert's own father lived. Social mobility in Tudor England moved slowly, and it moved unevenly, but it did move, particularly in a wool town like this one, where a skilled tradesman with steady hands and a good eye for cloth could, over the course of a lifetime, climb a rung or two on a ladder that had once seemed fixed in place forever. The fire is the first real task of the day, and it is Joan's, always Joan's, because a fire that has been properly banked the night before, covered in ash so that a few embers survive until morning, is a small quiet victory that most households depend on completely. Matches do not exist yet, not as you would recognise them. If the embers have died overnight, and sometimes they do, despite every precaution, then the whole business of striking a new flame from flint and steel and dry tinder has to begin. A slow and irritable process that can eat up a quarter of an hour on a bad morning. Joan has not had to do that in months. She takes a private, unspoken pride in it, the way some people today take pride in never having missed a flight or never having burned a pot of rice. Small competences, quietly held. She kneels by the hearth, breath still fogging faintly in the cool morning air even though it is not yet properly cold, and blows gently on the embers until a thread of smoke rises. Then a small orange tongue of flame catches in the kindling she has laid ready. The smell of it fills the room almost at once, wood smoke curling up toward the low ceiling, mixing with the older smell that never quite leaves a house like this. Tallow candles burned down the night before, wool fibres caught in every crack of the floor, the faint mineral smell of the packed earth itself. She feeds the fire slowly, patiently. Larger pieces of wood laid on once the flame is confident enough to hold them, and within a few minutes there is enough heat to hang the pot for the morning pottage. Robert is dressing by now in the loft above, and dressing for a man in his position is a far simpler business than it will become for wealthier men later in the century, when doublets grow padded and elaborate and require the help of a manservant just to lace correctly. Robert pulls on a linen shirt that reaches nearly to his knees, worn soft from years of washing, then woolen hose that he ties at the waist to a doublet, a simple padded jacket, undyed or dyed a plain brown or russet, nothing close to the deep blacks and reds that only the wealthy are permitted and honestly could afford, since the black dye in particular is notoriously expensive and difficult to fix properly into cloth. Over this goes a jerkin, a sleeveless outer layer, and finally his shoes, flat-soled leather things that will be resoled by the local cobbler more times over the coming years than Robert could easily count. There is a sumptuary law, technically, that governs exactly this kind of decision, dictating in fairly precise terms what fabrics and colours a man of Robert's station is permitted to wear. It sounds almost comical now, the idea of a law telling you what colour your coat can be, but at the time it was taken with real seriousness, an attempt by the Crown to keep the visible hierarchy of English society legible at a glance, so that a nobleman and a wool weaver could never be mistaken for one another on a crowded street. In practice, enforcement was patchy at best, especially out here, far from London's watchful eye, and Robert has never once been stopped or questioned about his jerkin. Still, he would not have chosen scarlet even if no one were watching. It would have felt to him like wearing someone else's name. Downstairs, Alison is already at the table, or rather at the plain wooden board that serves as a table, folding down a coarse blanket she's been using to keep the morning chill off her arms, while she waited for her mother to finish with the fire. She's spinning wool into thread most days now, using a simple hand spindle rather than the larger wheel that sits in the corner for when there is more time, and her fingers have grown calloused in a way that would have horrified her grandmother, who always said a lady's hands should stay soft. Alison is not a lady. Nobody in this house is under any illusion about that, and there is no bitterness in it, only a kind of clear-eyed practicality about where they stand in the world and what is expected of them within it. Breakfast, when it comes, is pottage, a thick soupy porridge made from grains, usually barley or oats, simmered for a long while with whatever vegetables are on hand, onions most often, sometimes a bit of dried peas from last autumn's store, occasionally a scrap of bacon if the week has been good to them. It is not glamorous food. It is not meant to be. It is meant to sit warm in the stomach through a long morning of physical labour, and it does exactly that every single day, with a reliability that modern breakfast cereal could only dream of matching. They eat it from wooden bowls called trenchers in some households, though the Baldwins' own trenchers are humbler versions, using horn spoons, since silver is unthinkable, and even pewter feels like a small extravagance reserved for Sundays and special occasions. There is a knock at the door just as Robert finishes his bowl, 3 quick raps that Joan recognises without needing to look up. It is Nick, Robert's apprentice, 14 years old, gangly in the way boys are at that age, all wrists and elbows still growing into a body that does not quite fit him yet. He has been apprenticed to Robert for the past 2 years, and will remain so for another 5, bound by a formal indenture that his father signed on his behalf. A document that legally obligates Robert to teach him the full craft of weaving, and legally obligates Nick to obey Robert, live under something close to his authority, and not marry, gamble, or frequent taverns during his term. It sounds severe when you list it out like that, and in some households it really was severe. Apprenticeship could be a hard and lonely road depending entirely on the temperament of the master who took you in. Robert, though, is not a hard man. He shouts sometimes, when a length of cloth comes off the loom uneven and a full day's work has to be picked apart and redone. But the shouting passes quickly, and Nick has come, over these 2 years, to think of the Baldwin household as something close to a second family, which is precisely what the old guild system was designed, at its best, to produce. Nick eats standing, a heel of yesterday's bread that Joan presses into his hands almost without thinking, a small kindness so habitual it has stopped registering as kindness at all, and then the three of them, Robert, Nick and increasingly Alison too when she's not needed elsewhere, move toward the loom that dominates the far corner of the room. It is a broad loom, wider than a man's outstretched arms, built from oak that has darkened over years of handling, and it takes up so much space that the family has arranged the rest of their small life around it, rather than the other way around. This is the heart of the household's income. Everything else, the hens, the small vegetable plot out back, the occasional day labour Robert takes on during slow seasons, all of it exists in orbit around this one large wooden machine and the cloth it produces. The sound it makes once Robert settles onto the bench and begins throwing the shuttle back and forth is something you would recognise instantly if you heard it, even though almost none of us have heard it in person. A rhythmic clack and thud, the beater bar striking the weft threads into place, over and over, hour after hour, a sound that must have been, for a child growing up in a weaver's house, as constant and unremarkable as traffic noises for a child today. Nick's job this morning is simpler, winding thread onto bobbins that will feed the shuttle, a repetitive task that leaves his mind free to wander, and wander it does, mostly toward the market that will be held 2 days from now, and whether he might, if he finishes his work early enough, be allowed to walk down and see it. That wool has a story worth pausing on for a moment, because it did not simply appear at Robert's loom fully prepared. It began as fleece from sheep grazing on the rolling chalk downs not far from the town, sheared in early summer by men who travelled from farm to farm with the season, their shears making a sound almost like slow scissors through paper, though far heavier in the hand than paper would suggest. The fleece was then washed, an unglamorous and honestly unpleasant task involving lanolin grease and dirt, and sometimes worse, before being carded, a process of combing the fibres straight using paddles studded with small metal teeth, so that they could finally be spun into the thread that women like Joan and Alison produce almost constantly, in every spare moment, because a single weaver working at Robert's pace can consume far more spun thread in a day than a single spinner can produce, and so an entire informal economy of spinning stretches out across the town and the surrounding villages, women working at spindles and wheels in kitchens and doorways and fields, an invisible labour force that historians have only in recent decades begun to properly account for. I find that detail worth sitting with for a moment. The word spinster, the word we now use, a little unkindly, for an unmarried older woman comes directly from this. An unmarried woman in Tudor England very often supported herself, entirely respectably, by spinning thread for the wool trade. It was not a mark of failure, it was a trade, a skill, a way of standing on your own 2 feet in a world that did not always make that easy for women to do. The word only curdled into an insult centuries later, long after the actual spinning wheels had gone quiet. A little before 9, Joan sets down whatever mending is in her hands and takes up the 2 wooden buckets that live by the door, because water does not arrive in this house by any means other than fetching it herself, a trip she makes at least twice a day to the town well, a short walk down the lane past 3 other houses much like her own. She's rarely alone on this walk. This morning she falls into step with her neighbour, a woman named Cecily Marsh, whose husband keeps a small flock of sheep on rented land just outside the town boundary, and the 2 women talk the way women who have known each other their entire lives talk, in half sentences, in shorthand, in a rhythm that would sound like nothing much to an outsider and means everything to them. Cecily has heard, because everyone in a town this size hears everything eventually, that the tanner's son has been asking after Alison. Joan's face does something complicated when Cecily brings it up, a flicker of surprise quickly smoothed over, and she says only that she had not noticed, which is not entirely true, and Cecily, being a good friend, does not push the point, though her eyebrows say plenty on their own. The tanner's trade is not a glamorous one. Tanning leather involves some actually foul-smelling processes, soaking hides in solutions that can include lime, and in some methods even dog dung or old urine collected specifically for the purpose, which is precisely why tanneries were required by most town ordinances to sit downwind and downstream of everyone else, usually near the edge of town by the river. It is honest work, and it pays reasonably well, since leather is needed for everything from shoes to harnesses to the bellows in a blacksmith's forge. But there is a reason tanners' sons were not generally considered the most desirable matches on the market. The well itself sits in a small open square near the centre of town, and it is here, more than anywhere else, that the actual business of the community gets conducted. Gossip, yes, but also genuine information. Who is ill? Who needs help bringing in a harvest? Whose cow has gone missing? What the miller is charging this week for grinding grain into flour? Joan draws up the bucket, hand over hand on the rope, the wooden pulley overhead making a small complaining creak with every turn, and while she waits her turn to fill the second bucket, she glances up at the church tower that dominates the town's low skyline, its bell not due to ring for another hour yet, marking the mid-morning service that most working families cannot actually attend on a weekday, though Sundays are a different matter entirely. Sundays are non-negotiable. There is something worth pausing on here, something that surprises people when they first hear it. Church attendance in Tudor England was not simply a matter of personal devotion, it was legally required, and the requirement had teeth. Under Elizabeth's religious settlement, failure to attend the parish church on Sundays and holy days without a valid excuse could result in a fine, a shilling for each absence, which does not sound like much until you understand that a shilling could represent a meaningful chunk of a labouring family's weekly income. So when the Baldwin family walks to church this coming Sunday, and they will, it is not purely out of faith, though their faith is genuine enough, it is also, in a very practical sense, the law, woven into the fabric of ordinary life so completely that most people never thought to question it any more than we question paying taxes today. Back at the house, the morning's work continues, the loom's steady clacking rhythm underneath everything else, and around midday Joan begins preparing the main meal, called dinner in this era rather than lunch, eaten in the early afternoon, and generally considered the largest and most important meal of the day, with supper later being a lighter affair. Today there is bread, always bread, dense and dark, made from a mixture of wheat and rye that most ordinary families relied on, rather than the pure white wheat bread reserved for the wealthy. There is cheese, a hard local variety that keeps well without refrigeration, obviously, since refrigeration is centuries away from existing. And there is a pottage again, though a heartier one than breakfasts, this one built around a bit of salted bacon and whatever vegetables the small garden plot behind the house has yielded, cabbage most likely, given the season, along with onions and a handful of dried herbs hanging from the rafters that Joan has grown and cured herself. I want to pause here on something that tends to surprise people, which is just how little meat an ordinary Tudor family actually ate on a regular basis, contrary to the image many of us carry of enormous joints of roasted meat piled onto pewter plates. That image belongs almost entirely to the nobility and the very wealthy. For a family like the Baldwins, meat was a periodic addition rather than a daily expectation. A bit of bacon here, perhaps a chicken on a Sunday if the hens have been generous with their eggs and one can be spared, salted pork through the winter months when a pig has been slaughtered and the meat carefully preserved to last as long as possible. Fish, interestingly, appeared more often than you might expect, partly for religious reasons, since certain days of the week, Fridays especially, were traditionally meat-free under church guidance, and partly because the river running near the town made fish a reasonably accessible option when meat was scarce or expensive. Alison eats quickly today, distracted, her mind clearly somewhere other than the table, and when her mother asks, not unkindly, whether something is troubling her, Alison simply shakes her head and says she is only tired from the spinning. Joan lets it go, for now, though she exchanges a small look with Robert across the table, the kind of look that passes between parents who have raised a child together long enough to read each other without needing words. There is a boy involved, there usually is at this age. Joan remembers being 15 herself, remembers a particular young man whose name she has not thought of in years, and finds herself smiling faintly into her bowl of pottage at the memory, a private smile that has nothing to do with anyone currently at the table. 2 days later, market day arrives, and it changes the entire character of the town for a single stretched-out morning. The Baldwins are up earlier than usual, before it is properly light, because Robert has finished a length of cloth he intends to sell directly, rather than sending it through the clothier, who usually handles the family's output. A small act of independence that will earn him a little more coin than usual if it goes well, and rather less if it does not, since selling directly means Robert himself has to stand in the market square and haggle, a skill he possesses but does not particularly enjoy. The market square, usually quiet enough that you could hear a dog bark from one end to the other, fills with stalls and carts and noise, so much noise, voices calling out prices, a rooster somewhere complaining loudly about being transported in a wicker basket, the creak of cartwheels on the uneven cobbles. There is a butcher's stall, the meat hanging in a way that would probably unsettle modern sensibilities, though nobody here thinks twice about it. There is a stall selling ribbons and small trinkets that catches Alison's eye for exactly as long as it takes her mother to notice her looking and steer her gently onward. Since ribbons cost coin, the family does not have to spare this week. There is a man selling pies from a covered basket, the smell of them cutting through everything else, meat and pastry, and a faint sweetness that suggests dried fruit has found its way into at least some of them. Robert sets up in the section of the square informally reserved for cloth sellers, unrolling his length of broadcloth across a trestle table borrowed from his brother-in-law, and within the hour he has drawn the attention of a merchant's agent, a man who buys cloth in bulk to be shipped down toward London, and from there, quite possibly, across the sea to Antwerp, which was, at this point in the 16th century, one of the great trading hubs of Europe, a city where English wool cloth arrived by the shipload to be dyed, finished, and redistributed across the continent. The negotiation takes a good 20 minutes, the agent running the cloth between his fingers, checking for evenness, holding it up to the light, making small dismissive noises designed to talk the price down, a performance Robert recognizes for exactly what it is, having watched his own father do the same thing decades earlier. They settle eventually on a price that satisfies neither man completely, which Robert has always privately felt is probably the sign of a fair deal. I think it is worth explaining briefly how a trade like weaving actually organized itself in a town like this, because the word guild gets thrown around a great deal in popular imaginings of this period, often without much precision. The weavers in this particular town belonged to a guild, yes, a formal association that regulated the quality of cloth produced, set standards for how apprentices were trained, and to some extent controlled who was permitted to practice the trade within the town's boundaries at all. It functioned as something between a trade union, a quality control board, and a social club, holding regular meetings, maintaining a shared fund to support members who fell ill or died leaving a family behind, and organizing the town's contribution to religious festivals and civic pageants throughout the year. Robert pays his guild dues twice yearly, grumbling about it every single time, and would nonetheless be properly alarmed if the guild ceased to exist, because it is, in a very real sense, his safety net in a world that offers almost none of the safety nets we take for granted today. Not everyone in the market square works in wool, of course. Past the cloth sellers, near the church end of the square, stands the blacksmith's forge, and even on a market day the forge does not stop, because horses still need shoeing and tools still need mending regardless of what else is happening in town. The blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man named Edward Hollis, works with his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the morning chill, sweat already beading on his forehead from the heat of the forge, and the sound of his hammer on the anvil, a sharp ringing clang, carries clear across the square, cutting through the market's general hubbub in a way that nothing else quite manages. Children gather to watch him sometimes, kept at a respectful distance by an invisible line only they seem to understand, fascinated by the sparks that fly when hot metal meets hammer, by the way the iron glows orange then dulls to black as it cools, by the hiss and cloud of steam when Edward plunges a finished piece into the water trough beside him. Edward's trade sits at the centre of nearly everything else in the town's economy, without most people ever quite noticing it. He shoes the horses that pull the carts that bring grain to the mill and cloth to market. He makes and repairs the tools the farmers use, the ploughshares and scythes and simple hand implements, without which no harvest would ever come in. He crafts hinges for doors, latches, the metal fittings on Robert's own loom when a piece wears out or breaks under the constant strain of daily use. If you asked the people of this town who the most important person among them was, most would probably name the local lord or perhaps the parish priest, and they would not think to mention Edward Hollis at all, and yet the whole visible fabric of their working lives depends, in more ways than anyone tallies up, on the man at the forge. By midday the market begins to thin, stalls packing up, carts creaking back out onto the roads leading to the surrounding villages, and the Baldwin family makes their way home with Robert's coin purse a little heavier than it was that morning, and Alison's mood noticeably brighter than it had been at breakfast, for reasons that become clear only when Joan notices her daughter glancing, more than once, toward the leatherworker's stall near the square's edge, where a young man with dark hair and an apron stained the particular tannish brown that leatherwork leaves behind is helping his father pack away unsold goods. Joan says nothing, not yet, but she notices everything, the way mothers do, filing it away for later. There is a younger child in the Baldwin household too, one I have not mentioned yet, a boy named Hal, 7 years old, too young for an apprenticeship of his own, but old enough now to be given small useful tasks around the house and yard, fetching kindling, chasing hens back into their coop when they wander, running errands down the lane that let him feel, for a few minutes at a stretch, wonderfully important. Hal does not attend school in any formal sense. Grammar schools existed in Tudor England, and their numbers were actually growing rapidly during this period, partly funded by the dissolution of the monasteries decades earlier, which had freed up land and money that found its way, eventually, into new educational foundations. But grammar school education was aimed primarily at boys, whose families intended them for the church, for law, for some form of learned profession, and it focused heavily on Latin grammar, hence the name, rather than anything Hal's family would consider practically useful. Robert can read a little, enough to manage his accounts and follow along haltingly during church services, taught by the parish priest during his own childhood in an informal arrangement that cost his father a few pence and a promise of occasional labour around the churchyard. Hal will likely learn the same way, a little reading, a little counting, enough to get by, and then the rest of his education will happen at his father's loom, watching, absorbing, eventually doing. Girls' education followed an even narrower path, generally speaking. Alison can read simple words, taught mostly by her mother from a small prayer book the family owns, one of their few plainly valuable possessions, but writing was considered less essential for a girl in her position, a skill that would matter more for a merchant's daughter who might someday need to manage her own household accounts at a more complex scale. What Alison has instead is an education in running a household that started almost as soon as she could walk and will not really end until she has one of her own to run, an accumulated, hands-on knowledge of spinning, brewing, cooking, preserving, simple medicine, animal husbandry, and 100 other small competencies that never get written down anywhere because nobody thought to write them down. They were simply passed from mother to daughter, generation after generation, an entire body of practical knowledge that has mostly vanished from historical record precisely because it was so thoroughly unremarkable to the people who possessed it. Medicine, in particular, sat largely in women's hands at this social level. A physician, trained and university educated, was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and in any case there was rarely one within easy reach of a small wool town like this. Instead, when someone in the Baldwin household falls ill, it is Joan who reaches first for the small collection of dried herbs hanging from the rafters and the modest stock of remedies she has learned, partly from her own mother, partly from Cecily Marsh next door, partly from a small handwritten collection of remedies that has been copied and recopied and passed between the women of the town for longer than anyone can quite trace. Feverfew for headaches, a poultice of crushed comfrey leaves for bruises and minor wounds, chamomile brewed into a weak tea for a restless stomach or a child who cannot settle at night, None of it is what we would now call scientific medicine, and some of the era's beliefs about the body, the four humours, the idea that illness stemmed from an imbalance between blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, sound almost fantastical to modern ears. But a good deal of it worked well enough, through trial and accumulated observation across generations, that families like the Baldwins survived on it and thrived on it more often than popular imagination tends to credit. Monday, in most households including this one, is wash day, and it deserves its own moment of attention because it was, without question, one of the most physically demanding regular tasks in the entire domestic calendar. Joan rises even earlier than usual, hauls water from the well not once but many times over, and heats it in the largest pot the household owns, set over a fire built up specifically for the purpose. The clothes and linens are soaked, then scrubbed by hand against a washboard, or in this household's case a simple flat stone kept specifically for the task, using a harsh soap made from tallow and wood ash lye that is hard on fabric and considerably harder on hands. Stains might require a paste of fuller's earth, a type of absorbent clay, worked directly into the fabric and left to draw the offending mark out before rinsing. The wet linens, once clean, are wrung out with real physical effort, Joan's forearms straining with it, and laid out or hung to dry, weather permitting, and if the weather does not permit, if a grey drizzle has settled over the town, the way it does more often than anyone would like, the washing hangs indoors instead, strung across the room near the fire, filling the small house with damp warmth and the faint mineral smell of wet wool for the better part of the day. By late afternoon, the physical work of the day begins to soften into something quieter. The light outside starts its long, slow slide toward evening, that particular quality of golden late afternoon sun that finds its way even through a small high window and lays a warm stripe across the packed earth floor. Robert steps back from the loom to rest his hands, cramped from hours of steady work, flexing his fingers slowly, working feeling back into them. Nick has gone home for the evening, back to his own family who live on the other side of town, though he will be back again before first light tomorrow. Hull has been called in from wherever he has wandered off to, and Alison sets down her spindle at last, rolling her shoulders, glancing once more, almost without meaning to, toward the window and the direction of the tanner's yard, though there is nothing to see from here, only the ordinary rooftops of an ordinary town settling into the ordinary business of evening. Supper is a smaller affair than dinner was, as it always is. Bread again, the last of the cheese, a little of the pottage reheated from midday, and the family eats it slowly, without the hurry of the working day pressing on them any more. Candles have been lit, tallow candles made from rendered animal fat, rather than the cleaner, sweeter-smelling beeswax that only wealthier households can afford, and they give off a light that is dimmer than you might imagine, a soft, unsteady glow that gathers everyone close around the table simply because that is where the light actually reaches. Beyond the small circle the candles cast, the room falls into a warm brown darkness, the loom in the corner reduced to a hulking shape, familiar rather than ominous, the ceiling beams disappearing upward into shadow. There is a particular smell to a Tudor evening that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely gone from the world now, vanished so completely that almost nobody alive has ever actually smelled it. Tallow smoke, slightly acrid, mixing with wood smoke from the hearth, mixing with the ever-present smell of wool, raw and lanolin heavy from the day's work, mixing with the yeasty smell of the small ale everyone in the household drinks, even the children, since the local water is not always reliable, and the ale, brewed weak and low in alcohol specifically for daily household consumption, is safer and considered more nourishing besides. Layer onto that the smell of the packed earth floor, faintly mineral, faintly damp, and the animal warmth of 5 bodies gathered close in a small space, and you begin to get some sense of what evening actually smelled like inside a home like this one. Not unpleasant, just entirely unfamiliar to a modern nose. Hal, full of supper and no longer required to be useful, begs his father for a story the way children have begged their fathers for stories since long before anyone thought to write any of them down, and Robert, tired as he is, rarely refuses. Tonight it is an old tale about a fox who outsmarts a farmer 3 times running before the farmer finally catches on. A story with roots stretching back further than Robert himself could say. Passed down to him from his own father the same way, told in this same room, probably by this same fire, though the fire itself has of course been rebuilt and relit 10,000 times since then. Hal listens with the particular fierce concentration only small children seem able to summon, and by the story's end his eyelids are already beginning to droop, the day's running and fetching finally catching up with him. Alison sits nearer the fire, mending a small tear in one of Hal's shirts by candlelight, her needle moving in small precise stitches that she barely has to think about anymore. And it is here, in this quiet stretch of the evening, that Joan finally finds the moment she has been waiting for all day. She does not confront her daughter, exactly. She simply sits down beside her, takes up her own mending, and after a comfortable silence asks, in a voice pitched low enough that it does not carry to where Robert sits with Hal, whether there is anything Alison wants to tell her. Alison's needle stops moving. For a long moment she says nothing at all, and Joan waits, because she has learned, over 15 years of raising this particular daughter, that Alison needs silence the way some people need noise, needs the space to arrive at her own words in her own time rather than being rushed toward them. What comes out, eventually, in a voice barely above a whisper, is not quite what Joan expected. It is not simply that Alison likes the tanner's son, though she does, a boy named Peter Wren, 17 years old, quiet and steady in a way that has caught her attention more than his looks have, if she is honest with herself. It is that Alison is frightened in a way she has not had words for until this exact moment, sitting by the fire with her mother's patient silence drawing the truth out of her almost against her will, frightened that if her parents do arrange a match for her, and they likely will within the next year or two, it might not be with Peter at all. It might be with someone chosen for entirely practical reasons, a family with better standing, a dowry arrangement that makes more sense on paper than any feeling ever could. Marriage among ordinary Tudor families was not purely a business transaction the way it often was among the nobility. There was real room for personal preference and mutual affection. Parents generally did seek some degree of willingness from their children before finalizing a match, but it was not purely a matter of the heart either, and Alison, at 15, has only just begun to understand the narrow space she will have to find her own way through, somewhere between those two truths. Joan does not offer easy comfort, because she does not believe in easy comfort, has never found it particularly useful in her own life. What she offers instead is honesty, gently delivered. She tells Alison that she cannot promise anything, that these things are rarely simple, but that she and Robert have never been the sort of parents who would force their daughter into a match that made her in fact miserable, and that Peter Wren, tanner's son or not, is known around town as a decent, hard-working young man, which counts for more than people sometimes credit. It is not a solution. It is not meant to be a solution. It is simply the truth, offered honestly, between a mother and a daughter, by firelight, while a needle sits forgotten in a half-mended shirt, and the fox in Robert's story, 3 fields away in Hal's now sleeping imagination, finally gets away clean. The rest of the evening unwinds slowly after that. Hal is carried up the ladder to the loft, more asleep than awake by the time his father lays him down on the shared pallet stuffed with straw that serves as his bed, a straw-filled mattress laid over a simple wooden frame strung with rope to give it some spring. Nothing like the deep, soft mattresses of even a modest home today, but familiar and warm enough once a body has grown used to it, especially with a woolen blanket, one of Robert's own weaving, pulled up close. Alison follows not long after, taking the small space beside her brother that has been hers for as long as she can remember, and Robert and Joan bank the fire together, one final task before their own rest, covering the embers carefully in ash the way Joan will uncover them again tomorrow morning, the whole cycle beginning again, as it always does, as it always will, until one day it will not, though none of them, thankfully, are thinking about that tonight. Outside, the town has gone quiet in the particular way a small place goes quiet after dark. No street lights, obviously, no sound of traffic, only the occasional dog barking somewhere across the rooftops, the distant call of an owl out past the last houses where the fields begin, and, if you stood still enough to listen for it, the faint sound of the river moving steadily along at the edge of town, indifferent to weavers and tanners and 15-year-old girls with frightened hearts, moving the same way it has moved for longer than the town itself has existed. And the same way it will keep moving long after everyone sleeping in these small houses tonight has been forgotten entirely. Sunday arrives the way it always does, marked first by the church bell, a deep unhurried sound that rolls out over the rooftops and reaches every corner of the town at once, calling people out of their houses in a way no other sound in their week quite manages. The Baldwins dress with a bit more care than usual, not finer clothes exactly, since finer clothes are not really something this household owns in any great supply, but their cleanest clothes, brushed and mended where needed, hair combed, faces washed properly rather than the quick splash that suffices on a working morning. Church attendance is, as I mentioned earlier, legally required, but watching the family prepare, you would not guess that legal obligation had much to do with what is actually happening here. There is a genuine warmth to it, an anticipation, because Sunday is, whatever else it is, the one day of the week when the entire community gathers in one place at one time, and that gathering carries a social weight far beyond its religious purpose alone. The parish church itself sits at the centre of town, stone-built, older than anyone can precisely date, its walls having witnessed the town's slow accumulation of houses and lanes over centuries. Inside, it is simpler now than it would have been a generation or two earlier, before the religious upheavals of Henry VIII's reign, and the further changes under his children stripped away much of the elaborate imagery, the painted walls, the side altars dedicated to various saints, that a Catholic congregation would once have known. Robert can remember his own grandfather describing, with a mixture of nostalgia and caution about who might be listening, how different the church interior had looked in his youth, brightly painted, richly decorated, before it was whitewashed and simplified under the new Protestant order. The Baldwins themselves have known nothing but the Reformed Church their entire lives, attend it without any sense of loss, though the town, like every English town of this period, still holds within it people who remember the old ways, and people who quietly, carefully, in ways that never quite rise to open defiance, prefer them. Seating in the church follows the same social hierarchy that governs everything else in the town's visible life. The local lord and his family, when they attend, which is not every week, occupy a designated pew near the front, elevated slightly, sometimes even curtained for privacy, a physical manifestation of social standing built directly into the architecture of worship. Robert and his family sit further back, in the body of the church proper, standing for much of the service, since fixed pews for ordinary parishioners were not yet universal in every church, though this particular building does have simple wooden benches along the side walls that the elderly and infirm are permitted to use. The service itself, conducted according to the Book of Common Prayer, runs considerably longer than a modern churchgoer might expect, and the sermon in particular can stretch on for the better part of an hour. The parish priest working through whatever scriptural passage he has chosen, with a thoroughness that Hal, at 7, finds nearly impossible to sit through without fidgeting, earning him more than one sharp look from his mother over the course of the morning. What happens after the service, though, is where the real social business of the week gets conducted. The churchyard becomes for a good half hour or more something close to a second market square, minus the goods for sale, families lingering to talk, news exchanged, matches quietly discussed between parents who have been circling the same idea for months, disputes aired and sometimes resolved informally before they ever need to reach the more formal attention of the manor court. Joan speaks at length with Cecily Marsh again, and this time the conversation drifts, unmistakably though never directly, toward Peter Wren and his family, Joan asking careful, casual-seeming questions about the tanner's business, his reputation, his prospects, questions that Cecily, sharp as ever, recognizes immediately for what they are, and answers with genuine helpfulness rather than teasing, because some conversations are too important for teasing. Robert, meanwhile, talks trade with the other men gathered near the church door. Prices, the state of the roads, a rumour that the price the merchant agents are paying for broadcloth might rise in the coming months if demand from the continent continues the way it has been. These conversations matter more than they might appear to on the surface. Information travelled slowly and unevenly in this period, No newspapers reaching a household like this one, no way to simply look up current market prices, and so the churchyard, week after week, functioned as one of the primary channels through which practical, economically important information actually moved through the community, alongside the gossip and the matchmaking and everything else. There is a particular kind of person present in nearly every churchyard gathering, one worth pausing on for a moment: the parish clerk, a man named Simon Pratt in this town, whose job extends well beyond the church itself. He keeps the parish register, a written record of every baptism, marriage, and burial in the town, a practice that had become mandatory across England only a few decades earlier, under a decree from Thomas Cromwell during Henry VIII's reign, and which now provides, centuries later, some of the only reliable records historians have of ordinary people's lives during this period, since kings and nobles get chronicled extensively by their own choosing, while a wool weaver and his family leave behind, in most cases, only these thin threads of official record: a christening here, a marriage there, a burial eventually, the bare bones of a life that once contained everything Robert and Joan and Alison and Hal are currently living through, all of it invisible to history except for these few administrative lines. By the time the family finally makes their way home, the sun well past its highest point, the mood has shifted subtly from the morning's more solemn obligatory feeling into something closer to genuine ease. Sunday afternoon, once the main obligations of the day have been met, offers a rare stretch of unstructured time, no weaving, no spinning expected, a pause built into the rhythm of the week that the family has come, over years, to quite treasure, even if none of them would think to describe it in those terms. Sunday afternoon, Hal disappears with a handful of other boys from the town to a stretch of common ground near the river, where a game that would look, to modern eyes, something like a rough early cousin of football is already underway, a rag-stuffed leather ball being kicked and chased and occasionally punched by an unruly cluster of boys, with essentially no formal rules beyond an unspoken agreement about which two piles of stones marked the goals. It was, by most contemporary accounts, a considerably rougher game than anything played today. Broken bones were not unheard of, and more than one town across England had at various points tried to ban it outright for exactly that reason. Hal comes home most Sundays with grass stains and at least one new bruise, and Joan has long since stopped worrying much about it, having decided years ago that a certain amount of bruising is simply the price of a healthy, active childhood. Alison spends the afternoon differently, walking with two other young women her age down toward the river, ostensibly to gather watercress that grows along its banks, though the gathering itself takes up considerably less time than the walking and talking that surrounds it. This is one of the few truly unsupervised stretches of time young unmarried women in this world are permitted, and they use it, as young women have always used such moments, to talk about exactly the things you would expect: who is being courted by whom, whose parents are being unreasonable about what, whose new baby has arrived and what it was named. It is a small pocket of freedom, carefully bounded, understood by everyone including their parents to be entirely proper, and treasured by the girls themselves precisely because it is theirs. I want to take a moment here to address something that comes up constantly whenever Tudor life gets discussed, which is the popular idea that people during this period simply did not bathe, that they were universally filthy, reeking, entirely unconcerned with cleanliness. It is one of those historical myths that has calcified into something close to accepted fact, despite being, in most respects, simply wrong. Full immersion bathing was indeed rare for a family like the Baldwins, mostly because heating enough water for a proper bath was a really laborious undertaking, not because of any indifference to cleanliness itself. What people did instead, and did regularly, was wash the visible parts of the body, face, hands, neck, using a basin and a cloth, daily or near enough to it, and change and wash their linen undergarments, their shirts and shifts, with real frequency, because it was understood, correctly, that the linen layer worn against the skin absorbed sweat and dirt, and needed regular washing, even when the outer garments, harder to clean and more expensive to replace, were washed far less often. Joan takes real pride in the family's linen, keeps it as clean as her considerable effort on wash day can manage, and would have been honestly insulted by any suggestion that her household was dirty in the way modern popular imagination sometimes assumes. Sleep itself, while we are on the subject, looked rather different in this period than it does now, in ways that occasionally surprise people. Historians have found reasonably strong evidence that many people across early modern Europe, this household very possibly among them, practiced what has come to be called segmented sleep. Waking naturally somewhere in the middle of the night for an hour or so of quiet wakefulness, praying, talking softly, tending to small tasks, or simply lying awake in the dark before returning to a second stretch of sleep until morning, without artificial light dividing the night into the single continuous block that a lit, electrified world eventually encouraged. The body seems to have settled, quite naturally, into this two-part rhythm instead. There is something almost comforting in that thought. If you find yourself occasionally awake in the small hours, unable to immediately fall back asleep, you are not broken, you are not doing anything wrong. You may simply be doing something closer to what human bodies did, quite naturally, for most of history, before the modern world convinced us that unbroken sleep was the only acceptable kind. By the time the family gathers again for supper, the sun beginning its long, slow descent toward the western hills, Sunday's particular texture, unhurried in a way the rest of the week never quite manages to be, has settled fully over the household. Robert sits for a while by the door simply watching the lane outside, greeting neighbours as they pass with a raised hand or a few unhurried words, and it strikes me, thinking about this scene, how much of what we now consider a luxury, unstructured time, permission to simply sit and watch the world go by without producing anything, was for this family a normal and expected part of their weekly rhythm, built directly into the calendar by centuries of religious and social custom, in a way that many of us today, for all our modern comforts, have somehow managed to lose entirely. Spring arrives properly a few weeks later, and with it comes May Day, the single most anticipated holiday of the entire working calendar for a household like the Baldwins, more eagerly awaited even than Christmas, because Christmas, for all its warmth, carries with it the deep cold and short daylight of midwinter, while May Day arrives precisely when the world itself seems to be waking back up, the fields greening, the air finally losing its bite, the whole town practically vibrating with relief that another dark winter has been survived. Preparations begin the evening before, when groups of young people, Alison among them this year for the first time since her mother has decided she is finally old enough, slip out before dawn to gather branches and blossoms from the woods just outside town, a tradition called going a-maying that carries within it a faint, only half-acknowledged echo of much older customs, pre-Christian customs, that the church has never quite managed to fully absorb or extinguish, despite centuries of trying. Hawthorn blossom especially, the flowering branches known simply as May, get gathered in armfuls and brought back to decorate doorways and windows across the town, filling the morning air with a sweet, slightly heavy floral scent that Joan has always associated, with the specific feeling of a winter finally, truly over. At the centre of the town green, a maypole has been raised, a tall stripped pine trunk brought in from the Lord's own woodland with his blessing, decorated with ribbons and greenery, and around it, once the morning's other business has been cleared away, the dancing begins, young and old joining in at various points throughout the day, the ribbons weaving and unweaving in patterns that require more coordination than they appear to from the outside, plenty of good-natured laughter erupting whenever someone loses the thread of the pattern and has to duck under 3 other ribbons to find their place again. There is a Maying Queen chosen too, a young woman crowned with flowers for the day, an honour that carries no real power beyond the day itself, but plenty of prestige, and this year the honour has gone to a girl from a neighbouring farm, much to the poorly disguised disappointment of at least 2 mothers in town who had quietly hoped it might go to their own daughters instead. Food and drink flow more freely on May Day than on almost any other occasion in the yearly calendar. Ale brewed specifically stronger than the household's usual daily variety, meat pies sold from stalls set up temporarily around the green's edge, and music, real music, a fiddler and a man with a simple wooden pipe providing a steady, cheerful backdrop to the whole afternoon, a sound so different from the loom's rhythmic clacking that Robert finds himself, more than once, simply standing still and letting it wash over him, a rare moment of pure unproductive pleasure in a life otherwise structured almost entirely around work. It is during this festival, in the loosened, celebratory atmosphere of the afternoon, that Peter Wren finally works up the nerve to ask Alison to dance, an invitation extended with visible awkwardness that Alison, watching him fumble slightly over the words, finds more endearing than any smooth confidence could have managed. They dance twice, not scandalously many times, not so few times as to suggest indifference, precisely calibrated by two young people who have clearly been thinking about exactly this calculation for weeks beforehand without ever admitting it to each other. Joan watches from a short distance away, pretending to be absorbed in conversation with another mother, while missing not one small detail of what is happening between her daughter and the tanner's son. And when Alison catches her eye across the green, flushed and smiling in a way Joan has not seen on her daughter's face in some time, Joan simply smiles back and says nothing, because some things do not need to be said aloud to be understood completely between a mother and a daughter. The day winds down slowly into evening, the maypole ribbons finally still, the fiddler packing away his instrument, families drifting back toward their homes tired and sun-warmed and, for one day at least, genuinely unburdened, carrying with them the particular kind of happiness that comes from a whole community choosing, together, to set its work aside and simply enjoy being alive in the world for a handful of hours. Summer brings the shearing, and this is worth lingering on, because it is in a very real sense the beginning of everything Robert does at his loom. The first link in a chain that ends, months later, in a merchant's warehouse across the sea. The sheep, grazed all year on the chalk downs a few miles outside town, are gathered in early June, driven in by farmhands and their dogs into a series of temporary pens built for exactly this purpose, and the noise of it, hundreds of sheep crowded together, bleating in a constant overlapping chorus, is something Robert experiences only once a year but never quite forgets, a wall of sound that seems to fill the entire valley. Skilled men who travel a regular circuit each year, moving from farm to farm across the region through the early summer weeks, take on the actual shearing, working with real speed, holding each animal firmly between their knees, working the fleece off in as close to one continuous piece as possible, since an intact fleece fetches a better price than one cut into scraps. It is hard, sweaty, unglamorous work, done at real speed, and a good shearer takes genuine pride in his pace, the best of them competing informally with each other throughout the day to see who can clear the most animals before evening. Robert does not shear himself, that is a specialized skill outside his own trade, but he comes out to the shearing grounds most years anyway, partly to buy fleece directly when he can get a better price that way than through the usual wool merchants, and partly, if he is honest, simply because he likes to see the whole process from its true beginning, the raw material that will eventually pass through his own hands and become something else entirely. Freshly shorn, the sheep look almost comical afterward, pale and strangely thin beneath fleece that had made them look twice their actual size, and they trot off into the summer pasture with what looks, to a fanciful eye, something like relief, freed of a winter's accumulated weight just as the weather turns properly warm. Hal finds this transformation endlessly funny every single year, laughing at the naked-looking sheep in a way that never seems to get old for him no matter how many summers pass. Not long after the shearing comes haymaking, an entirely different kind of physical demand, and one that pulls almost the whole town, weavers and tanners and blacksmiths alike, temporarily away from their usual trades to help bring in the grass that will feed livestock through the coming winter. It is properly all hands work, men cutting with long-handled scythes in a steady rhythmic sweep that takes real skill to maintain over hours without exhausting oneself too quickly. Women and older children following behind to turn the cut grass with wooden rakes, spreading it out to dry properly in the sun before it can be gathered into stacks. Robert's loom sits idle for the better part of a week during the heaviest haymaking days, an interruption to his usual income that he accepts without complaint, because the alternative, a town without enough hay to see its animals through winter, would be a far more serious problem than a few days of lost weaving. The weather during haymaking week takes on an almost anxious significance that modern life, with its weather apps and near-perfect forecasting, has largely forgotten. Rain on cut, drying hay can ruin an entire crop, causing it to rot or mould rather than cure properly, and so the whole town watches the sky with real attention through these critical days, farmers and townsfolk alike offering their own predictions based on cloud formations, wind direction, the behavior of swallows flying low or high, a whole informal body of folk meteorology accumulated over generations of paying very close attention to exactly this question. This year, fortunately, the weather holds, clear and warm for the full stretch needed, and the hay comes in dry and sweet-smelling, stacked into ricks that will stand through the coming months as a visible, reassuring measure of the town's preparedness for winter. This work leaves everyone, Robert included, browned by sun in a way his indoor weaving never manages. His forearms and neck a shade darker than the skin usually hidden beneath his shirt, and there is a particular satisfaction to it, a physical tiredness at day's end that feels different, somehow more honest, than the cramped hand and shoulder fatigue of a long day at the loom, even though Robert would tell you, without hesitation, that he is glad enough to return to his own trade once the haymaking is finished, his body simply not built or trained for a full week of scything and raking the way a farm labourer's is. Evenings during haymaking week carry their own particular character too, the whole crew of workers, drawn from across the town's different trades, sharing food and drink together at the edge of the fields once the day's light finally fails, a kind of temporary fellowship that cuts across the usual boundaries of guild and trade and social standing. Weavers sitting beside tanners, sitting beside the blacksmith's own apprentice, united for these few days by nothing more than shared physical exhaustion and the common goal of a winter's hay safely gathered in. Robert has always privately thought that these evenings, more than almost anything else in the yearly calendar, come closest to revealing what the town actually is underneath all its usual divisions, a single interconnected body of people who need each other, whether they think about it in those terms or not, considerably more than their day-to-day separateness would suggest. August brings the grain harvest, and if haymaking asked a great deal of the town, the grain harvest asks even more, because this crop, wheat, barley, rye, is the difference between a comfortable winter and a plainly hungry one, and everyone understands the stakes with a clarity that borders on reverence. The fields surrounding the town turn from green to gold over the course of a few weeks, and once the grain is judged ready, the whole rhythm of daily life bends around bringing it in as quickly and completely as possible, because a sudden storm at the wrong moment can flatten a standing crop and cost a family, cost the entire town dearly. Robert's loom falls silent again for the better part of 2 weeks this time, longer than during haymaking, and he works alongside the farm labourers and the other tradesmen of the town, swinging a sickle through long August days that start before dawn and do not end until the light entirely fails. Alison and Joan work too, further back in the line, gathering the cut stalks into bundles called sheaves, binding them tightly with twisted lengths of straw, and standing them upright in small clusters called stooks to dry further in the field before being carted away to the barn. Even Hal has a role now, 7 years old but old enough to help chase off the birds that gather hungrily at the edges of the field, hoping to snatch fallen grain, a task he takes with tremendous, slightly self-important seriousness, waving his arms and shouting at any crow bold enough to land within his self-appointed territory. There is an old custom observed in this town, as in most others across rural England, involving the very last stand of grain left uncut in each field. Rather than simply reaping it the same way as everything else, the harvesters would gather round it, and with something between ceremony and genuine superstition, cut it together in one final coordinated stroke, sometimes shaping the last bundle into a decorative form, a corn dolly, woven from the straw and kept, often through the following winter, hung somewhere in the house, believed by some, though by no means all, to hold something of the field's fertility within it until it could be ploughed back into the earth the following spring to ensure next year's harvest would be equally generous. Joan keeps one every year without really examining too closely whether she believes in its supposed power, in the same easy way many people today might keep a lucky object without quite committing to a full explanation of why. The harvest home, once the last cart of grain has finally rolled safely into the barn, is celebrated with a feast that rivals May Day in its enthusiasm, though it carries a different quality entirely, less the light-hearted joy of spring's renewal, and more a deep, bone-tired relief, the specific satisfaction of a dangerous, essential task finally, successfully completed. The lord of the manor traditionally contributes toward this feast, providing extra ale and sometimes meat beyond what the town's own resources would ordinarily stretch to, a customary obligation that both sides understand as part of the unwritten but very real agreement binding a landowner to the community that works his land. Long trestle tables are set up, and for one evening the usual careful boundaries around who eats with whom soften considerably, labourers and tradesmen and their families all seated together, sharing food that has, quite literally, just come out of the very ground beneath their feet. Robert eats that night with an appetite sharpened by 2 weeks of the hardest physical labour his year contains, and finds himself, more than once, glancing toward his own family scattered along the long table, Joan deep in conversation with Cecily, Hal already half asleep against his sister's shoulder despite the noise and music around him, Alison seated, not entirely by coincidence, near enough to Peter Wren and his family, that the two of them exchange more than a few quiet words over the course of the evening, words that Robert, watching from a small distance, chooses not to overhear too closely, giving his daughter the same measure of private space Joan has been quietly giving her for months now. What follows the harvest, over the coming weeks, is the equally essential work of preservation, because bringing the grain in is only the first half of the task, the second half being making sure it, and everything else the growing season has provided, actually lasts through the long months ahead when nothing fresh will grow at all. This is where Joan's particular expertise becomes most visible and most valuable. Apples from the small tree behind the house, along with what can be gathered or traded for from neighbours with larger orchards, get stored carefully in a cool corner of the house, each one checked and turned periodically through the winter to catch any beginning to spoil before they can affect the others. Cabbages and root vegetables, turnips and onions especially, get stored in a similar way, or in some cases buried in sand or straw to extend their keeping considerably beyond what open-air storage alone would manage. Herbs gathered through the summer hang drying from the rafters where they have hung, in one form or another all year, though the collection grows noticeably denser through late summer as this year's harvest joins whatever remains from the last. Meat preservation, when a pig is eventually slaughtered later in the autumn, involves salting and sometimes smoking, methods that draw moisture out of the meat and create an environment hostile to the bacteria that would otherwise spoil it within days, techniques refined over centuries of trial and painful error long before anyone understood the actual microbiology behind why they worked, understood only, and understood thoroughly, that they did work, reliably, which was all that mattered to a family whose survival through winter depended on getting it right. Michaelmas arrives at the very end of September, and while it carries some of the same communal feasting spirit as the harvest home, it serves a rather more practical purpose in the yearly calendar, marking, among other things, the date on which rents traditionally came due, and many annual contracts, including a fair number of apprenticeships and hired labour agreements, were either renewed or allowed to lapse. For a family like the Baldwins, who do not own their small house outright, but hold it on a fairly modest yearly rent from a local landowner, Michaelmas carries a small undercurrent of tension beneath its festive surface, the quiet, ever-present awareness of the coin that needs to be found and handed over, a rhythm of obligation that punctuates the whole year, regardless of how good or difficult any particular season has been for the household's finances. This year, thankfully, the rent is met without particular difficulty. The summer's steady weaving work, and Robert's better-than-usual sale at the spring market, having left the household in reasonably comfortable standing. Not every family in town can say the same. Cecily Marsh's husband, whose small flock had a difficult lambing season back in the spring, several ewes lost along with their lambs, a genuine setback for a household that depends heavily on that flock's yearly increase, has had to ask the landowner for a short extension, granted, this time without too much fuss, though everyone involved understands that such grace cannot be relied upon indefinitely, and Cecily has taken on extra spinning work these past months, her fingers moving almost constantly whenever Joan sees her, a quiet, uncomplaining response to a difficulty that nonetheless shows plainly in the faint new lines around her eyes. It is around this same time, as the nights properly lengthen and the first real chill settles over the town in earnest, that Hal takes ill, Nothing dramatic, nothing that would have alarmed anyone greatly, a fever and a persistent cough that keeps him restless and unhappy for the better part of 3 days, tucked into the loft bed with extra blankets piled over him, and a worried Joan checking on him every hour or so through each of those days. She brews a tea from elderflower and a bit of honey, warm and slightly sweet, coaxes him to drink it in small sips even when he protests that his throat hurts too much to swallow, and keeps a low fire burning through the nights to hold the worst of the autumn chill out of the small house. There is real fear underneath a moment like this, of course, in a period when childhood illness could turn serious with a speed and unpredictability that modern medicine has, thankfully, made largely unfamiliar to most of us today. Joan does not dwell openly on that fear, does not let Hal see it on her face, but Robert notices it in the particular quiet way she moves through those 3 days, the way she sits by the loft ladder a little longer than usual each night, before finally coming down to her own bed, listening for the sound of her son's breathing. On the 3rd night, the fever finally breaks, Hal waking the following morning pale but clear-eyed, asking in a small hoarse voice whether there might be any bread left from the day before. A question so ordinary, so entirely typical of him, that Joan finds herself laughing with relief before she has even finished answering him. By the following week, Hal is back to his usual self, chasing hens and running errands with his customary enthusiasm. The whole brief episode already fading into the kind of memory that gets folded, almost without remark, into the ordinary texture of a family's year, one of 100 small crises that arise and pass, and are, mostly, simply survived, without ceremony, without anyone stopping to declare how frightening it had briefly been. This is, I think, one of the quieter truths about lives like this one, lived so close to the edge of genuine uncertainty in ways most of us today rarely have to consider, that resilience of this kind was not treated as anything remarkable. It was simply what living asked of you, and Joan Baldwin, like countless mothers before and after her, met it without any particular fuss, because there was always the next day's bread to think of, the next task waiting, and worry, however real, could not be allowed to occupy more room than the household could actually afford to give it. The town itself, meanwhile, continues its slow autumn settling, the market square growing quieter as the weather turns, stalls selling fewer fresh vegetables now, and more of the preserved, stored kind, apples and dried peas and salted meat, the visible produce of the harvest already being drawn down as the long stretch towards spring properly begins. The days shorten with a speed that always seems to catch everyone slightly off guard, despite happening, reliably, every single year, and candles and firewood, both, take up an increasingly significant portion of the household's daily attention and daily expense, as the darkness lengthens at both ends of the day. Winter, when it finally arrives in full, changes the texture of the household's days more than any other season manages to. The loom keeps working, since cloth does not stop being needed simply because the weather has turned, but the hours available for it shrink considerably, daylight now a precious and carefully rationed resource, and Robert finds himself, more days than not, working by candlelight for at least an hour or two at either end of the day, squinting slightly at threads that are harder to distinguish clearly in the dimmer light, a small strain on the eyes that most weavers of this period simply accepted as an unavoidable cost of the trade, one of many small physical tolls that a lifetime of close, careful handwork exacts, without anyone making much comment about it. The house itself draws inward during these months, in every sense. The fire burns more constantly and more urgently, wood carefully husbanded from the stock gathered and split through the autumn, and the family spends far more of their waking hours gathered close around it than the warmer months ever require. Frost forms on the inside of the small window some mornings, delicate feathered patterns that Hal likes to trace with his finger before the room's gathering warmth melts them away, and the packed earth floor, so pleasantly cool underfoot in summer, now carries a persistent chill that everyone in the household has learned to counter with an extra pair of woolen socks, knitted by Joan through the long evenings, an ongoing project that never seems to reach any final completion since something is always wearing through somewhere. Christmas, when it arrives, unfolds not as a single day, but as a genuine season stretching across 12 days, from Christmas Day itself through to Twelfth Night in early January. and this stretch represents, without much competition, the richest and most eagerly anticipated period in the entire yearly calendar, more elaborate even than May Day, because it comes precisely when the year's hardest, darkest stretch most needs some counterbalancing warmth and light. Preparations begin well before the day itself. Joan has been saving small amounts of dried fruit through the autumn specifically for this occasion. Currants and raisins traded for at the last market before winter properly closed the roads to easy travel, and these go into a rich plum pottage, a thick spiced dish studded with the dried fruit and enriched, for this one occasion, with a bit of beef, considerably more generous with meat than the family's usual fare, that will be simmered for hours on Christmas Eve itself, filling the small house with a warm spiced smell entirely unlike anything else the year produces. The church, decorated now with holly and ivy gathered from the hedgerows in the days before, its usual whitewashed simplicity softened by greenery brought in specifically for the season, holds a service on Christmas morning that draws even the town's more occasional churchgoers out into the cold, everyone bundled thickly against weather that has, this particular year, brought an early dusting of snow, thin and quickly melted, but enough to lend the whole morning a hushed, softened quality. Footsteps muffled, sound carrying strangely across the white-dusted rooftops. Gift-giving in this period looks considerably more modest than it will become in later centuries, nothing resembling the elaborate exchange of presents a modern Christmas involves. But small tokens do pass between family members and close neighbours. A new pair of knitted gloves from Joan to Alison, carefully hidden until the right moment. A small carved wooden toy that Robert has been working on quietly in stolen moments over several weeks for Hal, whittled from a scrap of oak left over from some loom repair, shaped, with more patience than natural skill, into something that is recognisably, if not perfectly, a small dog. Hal's delight at receiving it, turning the little carved figure over and over in his hands, examining every rough edge with the total absorbed seriousness only a child can bring to such a simple object, is, Robert privately thinks, worth every one of the evenings he spent squinting at it by candlelight, cutting away small slivers of wood with more care than he generally allows himself for anything. The 12 days themselves carry their own loosely structured rhythm, work continuing but at a noticeably relaxed pace, more visiting between households than the rest of the year permits, more music, a fiddler making the rounds of several houses over the course of the season, more of the strong ale that gets specifically brewed in larger quantities for this stretch alone. There is a tradition, too, observed with real enthusiasm in this town, of a lord of misrule chosen from among the younger unmarried men, presiding over a night of deliberately upside-down, playful chaos, roles briefly reversed, ordinary rules of decorum suspended within carefully understood limits, a pressure valve built directly into the calendar that lets a fairly rigid, hierarchical society blow off a controlled amount of steam once a year without any lasting disruption to the order that resumes, entirely unchanged, the following morning. Twelfth Night itself, the season's closing celebration, brings the whole extended stretch to its natural end with one final feast. A special cake baked with a single dried bean hidden somewhere inside it, and whoever finds the bean in their slice is crowned king or queen of the bean for the remainder of the evening. A small honorary role that carries no real consequence beyond a bit of good-natured teasing and the privilege of directing the evening's games. This year the bean falls, entirely by chance, to Alison, who takes her brief reign with more genuine delight than she probably expected to, directing a round of simple parlour games with an authority that has Hal, briefly, treating his older sister with something close to actual reverence, an arrangement Alison privately enjoys rather more than she would ever admit aloud. And then quite suddenly it always seems, the season closes. The greenery comes down from the church and from the doorways where it has hung for nearly 2 weeks, considered, by long custom, unlucky to leave up any longer than Twelfth Night itself. The fiddler's rounds end. The loom, which had continued through the season but at its own relaxed pace, returns to its full working rhythm, and the household settles back into the longer, quieter, colder stretch of true winter that still lies ahead before spring's first real signs will begin to show themselves again along the hedgerows and in the lengthening light. There is a part of the wool trade that happens almost entirely outside Robert's own house, and it is worth following the cloth a little further along its journey, because the piece he wove and sold that market day months ago did not simply travel straight to a merchant's warehouse in its raw, undyed state. Most broadcloth passed first through a fulling mill, and there is one situated a short walk outside town, built where a stream drops fast enough over a small natural fall to turn a wooden wheel with real force. Fulling is a process that thickens and strengthens woven cloth, traditionally done in earlier centuries by workers literally trampling the wet cloth underfoot in troughs, a method some poorer households still practiced by hand when they could not afford or access a mill. But by this period the mill's mechanical hammers, great wooden mallets lifted and dropped by the turning water wheel, do the same pounding work far more efficiently, beating the cloth again and again in a bath of water and a cleansing substance called fuller's earth, the same absorbent clay Jones sometimes uses on stubborn laundry stains, which draws the remaining grease and lanolin out of the wool fibres. The sound of the fulling mill carries a good distance on a quiet day, a heavy rhythmic thudding entirely different from the lighter clack of Robert's loom, and Nick, sent there occasionally to deliver or collect cloth on his master's behalf, has always found something faintly unsettling about the great hammers rising and falling with such steady mechanical patience, as though the mill itself were some enormous, slow-breathing creature going about its own private business regardless of who came or went around it. The miller who operates it, a taciturn man named Walter Cobb, charges by the length of cloth processed, and Robert, like most weavers in town, has long since worked this cost into his own pricing without much complaint, understanding fulling as simply one more necessary stage the cloth must pass through before it is truly ready for sale. Dyeing, when it happens, generally happens after fulling, sometimes at the mill itself if Walter has the appropriate vats and knowledge, though for finer or specifically coloured cloth the work more often travels to a dedicated dyer in a larger town nearby, since dyeing well requires real specialised skill and closely guarded knowledge about how to fix colours properly so they will not fade or run at the first hard rain. Woad, grown locally and processed through a in fact pungent fermentation process that Robert has smelled from a considerable distance and never cared to get closer to than necessary, produces the blues that show up reasonably often in ordinary clothing, being one of the more affordable dye options available. Madder root produces reds ranging from a soft brick tone to something considerably richer depending on how it is prepared and mordanted, a chemical fixing process using substances like alum that helps the colour bind properly to the wool fibres rather than washing straight back out. The truly expensive dyes, the deep, saturated blacks, and the vivid scarlets made from imported cochineal insects, remain, as we discussed earlier, largely out of reach for a household like the Baldwins, both by cost and, in the case of certain colours, by the sumptuary restrictions technically governing who was even permitted to wear them. Most of what Robert himself weaves stays undyed, sold as what is called white cloth, or is dyed only after it reaches the merchants who will ship it onward, since dyeing represents an additional cost and risk that many weavers of his modest standing prefer to let the buyer assume rather than take on themselves. There is something Robert finds quietly satisfying, though, in imagining the cloth's eventual colour a length of his own plain undyed broadcloth, perhaps becoming, months from now, a rich blue coat worn by some merchant's wife in a city he will never visit. The raw material of his own patient hours at the loom, transformed into something considerably grander than he will ever personally see, a small, strange kind of connection reaching outward from this modest wool town into a wider world Robert mostly only hears about second-hand. Beyond the town itself, a short walk along a well-worn lane, stands the manor house, home to the family that holds the surrounding land and, by extension, a considerable amount of influence over the daily lives of everyone who works it or lives upon it. It is not a grand house by the standards of the truly wealthy, nothing like the vast new prodigy houses that ambitious courtiers were beginning to build elsewhere in England during this period, structures designed explicitly to dazzle and to signal wealth on an almost theatrical scale. This is a more modest gentry house, timber-framed like much of the town below it but considerably larger, with real glazed windows, a genuine luxury that catches the afternoon light in a way the Baldwins' own small shuttered window never could, and a walled garden that Joan has glimpsed only once or twice through the gate on the rare occasions her errands have taken her that far. The Lord himself, a man named Sir Edmund Ashworth, holds his position through inheritance stretching back several generations, though the family's fortunes have waxed and waned considerably over that time, a fact known to essentially everyone in town, despite never being discussed openly in his presence. He is neither an especially harsh landlord nor an especially generous one, by most accounts, which is in its own way exactly what a tenant like Robert hopes for, since the quite harsh landlords of this period could make a tenant family's life considerably more difficult through arbitrary rent increases or inflexible enforcement of manorial obligations, while the genuinely generous ones were rare enough to be remarked upon specifically whenever they appeared. Robert's relationship to Sir Edmund runs through a whole web of customary obligations that would seem, to a modern eye, almost bewilderingly complicated, though everyone within the system understands it perfectly well, simply through having grown up inside it. There is the yearly rent, obviously, but beyond that, certain days of labour owed to the manor at specific points in the agricultural calendar, a custom holding on in modified form even as the older, more rigid structures of feudal obligation had loosened considerably by this point in the Tudor period. There are manor courts, held periodically, where minor disputes between tenants get formally settled, boundary disagreements, complaints about stray livestock, matters too small for the more distant royal courts, but requiring some official resolution nonetheless, and Robert has sat through more than a few of these sessions over the years, sometimes as an interested party, more often simply as a member of the jury of local men called upon to help render judgment on their neighbours' disputes. What Sir Edmund's household provides in return for all of this, beyond simple landholding, is a kind of anchor for the whole local community's sense of order, and in harder years, a genuine if imperfect safety net. The parish system of poor relief that had developed steadily across England throughout the Tudor period, formalised eventually into law under a series of poor laws passed toward the century's end, drew its funding partly from a mandatory local tax, the poor rate, that fell disproportionately on wealthier residents like Sir Edmund, and was administered by parish officials, overseers of the poor, appointed from among the town's more established residents, who distributed what relief they could to those really unable to support themselves, the elderly without family to care for them, widows with young children and no trade of their own, those left disabled by illness or accident. It was not, by any modern standard, a generous system, and it drew real distinctions, sometimes harsh ones, between what the period called the deserving poor, those judged honestly unable to work through no fault of their own, and those considered simply idle, a distinction that could be applied with considerable unfairness depending on who was doing the judging. But it existed in a form that many earlier and even some later periods of English history did not manage to sustain consistently, and Joan, when she thinks about it at all, considers herself and her family fortunate to stand comfortably on the working, contributing side of that particular line, rather than the side that had to depend on the parish's uncertain and often grudging charity. There is an elderly widow 2 lanes over, a woman named Marjorie Fenn, whose husband died some years back, leaving her without a trade of her own to fall back on, who receives a small weekly allowance from the parish, along with occasional practical help from neighbours, Joan among them, who sends Alison round with a portion of bread or a bit of the household's surplus produce whenever there is any to spare, a small unofficial supplement to the parish's own more formal and considerably thinner provision. By the time the following spring arrives, a full year having turned since that first evening by the fire when Alison finally spoke her fears aloud to her mother, the matter of Peter Wren has moved well beyond stolen glances at the market and 2 careful dances on a village green. Robert and Joan have spoken with each other about it many times through the intervening months, weighing what they know of the Wren family, weighing Alison's own clear and now openly acknowledged preference against the more practical calculations that any marriage in this world necessarily involves, and have finally, this past week, sat down with Peter's own father, the tanner, a broad, quiet man named Hugh Wren, to discuss the matter properly. This conversation, which took place not in either family's own house, but in neutral, comfortable territory at the town's small tavern, over shared ale, followed a shape that would have been instantly recognisable to nearly anyone in Tudor England, regardless of social standing, though the specific sums and terms discussed varied enormously depending on the families involved. At its heart was the question of the dowry, the portion Alison would bring into the marriage, not the vast estates and elaborate legal settlements that concerned the nobility, but something considerably more modest, and, for a family like the Baldwins, considerably more meaningful in proportion to what they actually possessed. Robert offered a sum in coin that he and Joan had been quietly setting aside for exactly this purpose for several years now, small amounts saved back whenever the household's finances allowed it, along with a promise of household linens that Joan and Alison had been steadily accumulating and mending toward this same eventual purpose, sheets and towels and the like, a young bride's beginning stock for a household of her own. Hugh Wren, for his part, spoke plainly about what Peter could offer in return. Having already largely learnt the tanning trade well enough to support a household of his own, with his father's blessing to eventually take over a portion of the family business, along with a small cottage near the tannery that Hugh owned outright and was prepared to make available to the young couple once married, rather than requiring them to build or rent something new. It was, by the standards of the town, a solid match on both sides, practical and comfortable rather than especially grand, and both fathers, having each done their own private arithmetic beforehand, arrived at terms without any real difficulty or drama, shaking hands on the arrangement with the same unhurried satisfaction they might have brought to settling the price of a good length of cloth. What struck Robert most, walking home afterward in the cooling evening air, was how little of the actual conversation had concerned itself with whether Alison and Peter were fond of each other, a question that both fathers had simply taken as already settled, already obvious, and had treated more as a pleasant, welcome bonus to a sensible arrangement than as the central point around which the whole negotiation turned. This was not, Robert reflected, because either family considered affection unimportant, but because the practical bones of a marriage, in a world without much financial cushioning for anyone, mattered enough on their own terms that they had to be settled properly regardless of how the young people involved felt about each other, and it happened, in this particular case, that the practical bones and the young people's own hearts pointed in exactly the same comfortable direction, sparing everyone involved the more difficult negotiations that arose in households where they did not. Alison received the news that evening with an outward composure that fooled her mother for perhaps all of 30 seconds before the girl's carefully held expression cracked into open, unguarded delight, throwing her arms around Joan's neck with a force that nearly toppled them both, laughing in a way that filled the small house with a warmth Joan would remember for a long time afterward. Hal, 7 years old, going on 8 now, and only dimly grasping what any of it fully meant beyond the promise of an eventual celebration with, he sincerely hoped, plenty of good food involved, mostly wanted to know whether he would get to keep visiting his sister's new house once she moved into it, a question Alison answered by scooping him briefly off his feet, despite his indignant protests that he was far too old for such treatment. The betrothal itself, once the practical terms were settled between the two fathers, was formalized a few weeks later with a simple ceremony before witnesses, hands joined, promises spoken, a ritual carrying real legal and social weight in this period, considered by many almost as binding as marriage itself, breach of a formal betrothal being a matter that could, in more serious cases, actually come before the church courts. The wedding proper would follow that autumn, once the harvest was safely in and the household's finances, on both sides, had settled into their usual comfortable post-harvest footing, a timing chosen with the same practical good sense that had governed nearly every other decision in this whole unfolding matter, romance and practicality, walking hand in hand through the entire affair, in a way that felt, to everyone involved, not like a compromise, but simply like how things were properly, sensibly done. The wedding, when autumn finally brings it, unfolds on a clear, mild morning that Joan takes, quietly, as a good omen, though she would never say so aloud, having always considered herself a practical woman rather than a superstitious one, whatever small private exceptions she might make on occasions that matter enough to her. Alison rises earlier than she has in months, unable to sleep much past the first grey light, and the morning that follows has a particular hush to it, the ordinary bustle of the household's usual routine suspended for once, replaced by something quieter and more careful. Her dress is not new, not entirely, since new cloth for an entire garment represented a real expense that even a comfortable family like the Baldwins considered carefully, but it has been remade specifically for the occasion from a good length of blue wool, dyed with woad in a soft, clear shade that suits her, cut and fitted by Joan's own hands over several evenings' careful work, with a fresh linen partlet, a modest covering piece for the neckline, and sleeves that Joan has trimmed simply but attentively with a narrow band of contrasting cloth. There is no elaborate lace, no jewels beyond a single small ring that has been in the Baldwin family for 2 generations now, passed down and waiting, it seems, specifically for this morning. Alison's hair, worn loose rather than covered as it will be after today, since married women in this period generally kept their hair covered in public as a matter of both practicality and social signal, has been brushed by her mother until it shines, and Joan works a few small late-season flowers into it, gathered from the hedgerows that morning by Harl, sent out specifically for the task and taking it, characteristically, with tremendous seriousness. The ceremony itself takes place at the church, as nearly all weddings in this period did, following the marriage service laid out in the Book of Common Prayer, a form of words that had become deeply familiar to everyone in the congregation through having heard it recited over other couples across the years, though it never quite loses its particular weight when it is finally your own turn to hear it spoken over you. Robert walks his daughter the short distance from the house to the church, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and finds himself, somewhat to his own surprise, considerably more affected by the walk than he had expected to be, swallowing hard more than once against a tightness in his throat that he attributes, when Joan glances over at him with a knowing look, to nothing more than the morning chill. Peter waits at the church door rather than at the altar itself, since Tudor weddings traditionally began there, the priest conducting the opening portion of the service, the actual exchange of vows and the giving of the ring, at the church entrance before the whole gathered congregation, only moving inside for the nuptial mass and blessing that followed. Peter has clearly taken as much care with his own appearance as Alison has with hers, his usual leather-worker's apron and stained clothes replaced for the day with his own best doublet, dark green, his hair combed flat in a way that keeps threatening to spring back up despite his evident efforts, and a look on his face when Alison arrives, walking the last short stretch of lane on her father's arm, is one that Joan, watching from a few steps back, finds so nakedly, openly happy that it brings a sudden unexpected sting of tears to her own eyes. The vows themselves are spoken clearly, if with a slight tremor in both young voices, promises to have and to hold, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health, words that have been spoken at this same church door countless times before, and will be spoken countless times again, and yet carry, in this particular moment, for this particular couple, the same weight of complete, unrepeatable significance they must have carried for every couple who ever stood here before them. The ring, when Peter places it on Alison's finger, is a plain gold band, modest but genuine, purchased with money Peter had been quietly saving from his own share of the tannery's earnings for longer than anyone, even his own father, had fully realized. Once the church portion of the day concludes, the celebration moves, as these things did, into a feast held partly at the Baldwin house, and partly, given the size of the gathering, spilling out into the lane and the small open space near it. Tables borrowed from neighbours, food contributed by nearly everyone who has any connection to either family, a genuine communal effort that speaks to how thoroughly woven both the Baldwins and the Wrens are into the wider fabric of the town's daily life. There is far more meat on the tables than the household would ordinarily see in a month of usual eating, a whole roasted pig contributed jointly by several families, along with pies, both sweet and savoury, fresh bread rather than the household's usual denser everyday loaves, and ale flowing generously enough that by mid-afternoon the gathering has taken on a distinctly festive, loose-limbed quality, music striking up again, dancing spilling out across whatever open ground can be found. Robert, watching his daughter dance with her new husband, her face flushed with happiness and exertion, and probably a bit more ale than she is entirely accustomed to, finds himself thinking, not for the first time this year, about how strange and quick this particular kind of time feels in retrospect, the 15 years between a squalling newborn placed in his arms and this laughing young married woman spinning across a village lane having somehow compressed themselves, looking back into what feels like no time at all, even though he could, if pressed, account for nearly every one of those years in considerable, exhausting detail. That is simply what watching a child grow does to a parent's sense of time, he supposes. It does not feel long while you are living it. It only feels long, unbearably long, and impossibly short simultaneously, once you turn around and try to measure the whole distance travelled at once. By evening, the newly married couple has slipped away to their own small cottage near the tannery, escorted part way by a good-natured, only slightly rowdy crowd of well-wishers who eventually peel off, laughing, back toward their own homes, leaving Peter and Alison to begin, properly, the first night of a household that belongs to no one but themselves. Joan and Robert walk home slowly through the cooling evening, Hal already asleep on his father's shoulder, worn out from a day of feasting and excitement that has thoroughly exceeded his usual capacity, and the house, when they finally reach it, feels different already, quieter in a way that has nothing to do with sound and everything to do with the particular, permanent shift a family undergoes the first time one of its own steps out to build a life of her own elsewhere. The cottage Alison moves into is smaller than her parents' house, a single room much like the one she grew up in, though it sits close enough to the tannery that the particular smell of that trade reaches it more directly than she had perhaps fully appreciated during her visits there as a courting young woman rather than a resident. She grows accustomed to it faster than she expected, the human capacity for adjusting to a new ordinary being, as it so often is, considerably more flexible than anticipated beforehand, and within a few weeks she finds she barely notices the smell at all, except on the particular days when a fresh batch of hides has just come in, a fact she reports to her mother with more amusement than complaint on one of her regular visits back to the family home. Setting up her own household, small as it is, occupies Alison's early months of marriage, with a real and satisfying kind of purpose, arranging the linens she brought as her dowry portion, learning the particular quirks of a hearth that behaves differently from the one she grew up cooking on, negotiating gently and without much real friction the small daily compromises that any new household between two previously separate people requires. Peter, it turns out, has strong and somewhat particular opinions about how bread should be baked, learned from his own mother, that differ in small ways from how Joan always did it, and Alison finds herself, in these early weeks, quietly absorbing a whole new set of small domestic habits, some of which she adopts readily, and some of which she gently, diplomatically works to bring around closer to her own preferences over time. The ordinary negotiation of two households merging into one, playing out in 100 small daily decisions that neither of them would think to describe as significant, though together they form the actual substance of a marriage being built. Joan visits often in these early months, more often, if she is honest with herself, than is strictly necessary, using small pretexts, a bit of surplus produce from the garden, a question about a recipe, to justify the walk across town more frequently than her own mother had visited her at the same stage of her own marriage decades earlier. Alison does not seem to mind. If anything, she seems to look forward to these visits with a warmth that suggests the distance between her old household and her new one, though real, has not diminished the closeness between mother and daughter in the way Joan had quietly, privately worried it might. Peter, meanwhile, continues deepening his own place within his father's trade, working alongside Hugh Wren with the particular focused attention of a young man who understands, now, that he is not simply learning a craft anymore, but building the actual foundation of the household he now heads. The tanning trade, whatever its unglamorous reputation, provides a actually steady living, leather being needed constantly and universally across every level of society, and Peter's own developing skill, along with his father's established reputation and customer relationships, suggest a comfortable, if unspectacular, future ahead for the small household. Exactly the kind of quietly secure prospect that had made the match sensible in the first place, now beginning to bear out in practice rather than remaining merely theoretical. By the time the first anniversary of their wedding approaches, Alison finds herself on a morning that catches her slightly off guard despite months of half suspecting it might come, feeling distinctly unwell in a way that has nothing to do with any illness, a persistent morning queasiness that Cecily Marsh, consulted quietly and sworn to a discretion she honours completely, recognises immediately and correctly for exactly what it is. When Alison finally works up the courage to tell her mother, choosing a quiet moment much like the one by the fire that had started this whole chapter of her life over a year earlier, Joan's reaction is immediate and entirely without the careful diplomacy she had brought to that earlier conversation, pulling her daughter into an embrace so sudden and so fierce that Alison laughs even through the lingering queasiness, both women, for a moment entirely undone by a happiness too large and too immediate to manage with any of their usual composure. I want to step back for a little while now, away from the Baldwin household specifically, and simply sit with some of the broader texture of ordinary life in this period, the small details that rarely make it into the grander histories focused on kings and queens and the great political dramas of the Tudor court, but which shaped the actual daily experience of nearly everyone living through this remarkable century, far more directly than any royal proclamation ever did. Take something as simple as time itself, and how differently it was actually experienced by people like the Baldwins compared to how we experience it now. There were no personal clocks in a household like this one, no watches obviously, and the church bell served as the primary public marker of the day's major divisions, though most people's actual sense of time through the working hours was governed far more by the sun's position, by the rhythm of tasks that needed doing, than by any precise numerical hour. Robert did not think of his day as beginning at 6 and ending at 8. He thought of it as beginning when there was enough light to see the loom properly, and ending when the light failed or the work itself was done, a far more fluid, seasonal relationship with time than the rigid clock-bound schedule most of us now take entirely for granted, checking our phones dozens of times a day for a precision of timekeeping that would have seemed to Robert almost bewilderingly unnecessary for the kind of life he actually led. Entertainment too looked considerably different, shaped almost entirely by what could be produced without electricity, without any recorded sound or image, relying instead on live performance and direct human presence for essentially everything. Travelling players occasionally passed through towns like this one, small troupes performing short plays or interludes in the yard of the local inn, drawing a crowd that would gather informally, paying what small amount they could afford, sometimes nothing at all beyond simply standing at the edges to watch. Ballads, printed cheaply on single sheets and sold by travelling peddlers, carried news and stories and gossip set to familiar tunes that ordinary people could learn quickly and pass along by ear, functioning as something between a newspaper and popular music, spreading everything from genuine current events, often wildly embellished, to old traditional tales dressed up in new verses. Robert has more than a few of these ballad sheets tucked away, not because he can read every word of them with total fluency, but because Joan can manage them well enough to sing the tunes at home, and Hal has learnt at least 3 of them well enough to sing along, usually rather more loudly and enthusiastically than the actual quality of his young voice strictly warrants. The town's single inn deserves a moment of attention too, since it served a function considerably broader than simply providing beds for travellers passing through, which, in a town this size, off the main roads that connected the larger cities, happened rarely enough that lodging was probably the inn's least significant source of income. It was, more than anything else, the town's primary gathering place for adult men after the working day ended, somewhere Robert visits perhaps once a week, sharing a pot of ale with Hugh Wren or Edward Hollis the blacksmith, or whichever other men happened to be present, conversation ranging across trade prices, town gossip, occasional half-serious arguments about matters of local politics, the general unhurried social currency that flows through any small community's regular gathering spot. Women were not entirely excluded from inns and taverns in this period, contrary to another popular modern assumption, though a respectable married woman like Joan would generally have specific, limited reasons for visiting one rather than simply dropping in for casual socializing the way Robert might. Social custom drawing a real if not absolute line around exactly this kind of space. Proverbs and sayings, a small aside worth taking, filled ordinary Tudor speech in a way that has actually left a surprisingly durable mark on the English language as it exists today, more durable than most people realize. When Robert tells Nick that a particular length of poorly woven cloth is not worth crying over once the damage is done and cannot be undone, he is using a version of an expression that would have been entirely familiar across the whole of Tudor England, one among literally hundreds of proverbial sayings that circulated constantly through everyday conversation, providing a kind of shared shorthand wisdom that everyone recognized and drew on, without needing to think much about where any particular phrase had originally come from. A surprising number of expressions still used casually today, about striking while iron is hot, about not looking a gift horse in the mouth, about the early bird catching the worm, either originated in this general period or were already well established and in common circulation by the time the Baldwin family was living through it. A small but genuine thread of linguistic continuity connecting the way we still talk today to conversations that happened, essentially unrecorded, in kitchens and taverns and market squares just like this one, nearly 5 centuries ago. Clothing, beyond what I described earlier regarding Robert's own working dress, involved a degree of practical ingenuity that modern fast fashion, with its assumption of easy replacement, has largely made unfamiliar to most of us. Garments were expensive relative to income, properly expensive, representing a real and carefully considered household expenditure rather than a casual purchase, and so clothing was mended, extended, and repurposed with a thoroughness that would strike most people today as remarkable. A worn shirt collar might be turned, the less faded underside of the fabric brought to the visible outer edge to extend its useful life by months or even years. Children's clothes were let out at the seams as they grew, rather than simply replaced, and clothes that a growing child had plainly outgrown were very often passed down to a younger sibling or a neighbor's child, rather than discarded. A whole informal economy of garment circulation moving quietly through the town alongside its more formal coin-based trade. Back at the loom, Nick has grown up considerably since we first met him winding bobbins on that early morning. Taller now, his voice settled into something closer to its adult register, and Robert has begun, over the past year or so, trusting him with genuinely skilled work rather than simple preparatory tasks, letting him take the bench at the loom itself for stretches at a time under close supervision, watching him gradually develop the particular feel for tension and rhythm that separates competent weaving from truly good weaving, a quality that cannot really be taught directly so much as absorbed slowly through sheer accumulated hours of practice and correction. There have been mistakes along the way, plenty of them, cloth that came off uneven and had to be picked apart, threads that broke at inconvenient moments requiring careful, patient repair, and Robert has indeed shouted on more than one occasion, briefly and without real lasting anger, the way he told you he would back when Nick first arrived as a gangly 14-year-old, still growing into his own limbs. But watching Nick work now, 3 years further into his apprenticeship, Robert finds himself experiencing something close to genuine pride, an unexpected feeling he had not fully anticipated when he first agreed to take the boy on, a sense of investment in another young person's growing competence that runs surprisingly deep, deeper, if he is honest, than he would have guessed a formal business arrangement like an apprenticeship could ever produce. The town's mill, separate from the fulling mill mentioned earlier and situated on a different stretch of the same river, grinds grain into flour for the whole surrounding area, and the miller, a heavy-set, perpetually flour-dusted man named Josiah Hart, occupies a curious and not always entirely trusted position within the town's social fabric. Milling was, by long custom across most of England, subject to a system where local farmers and townspeople were often required, or at least strongly expected, to bring their grain specifically to the manor's own mill rather than seeking a better price elsewhere, an arrangement that gave millers like Josiah a kind of quasi-monopoly position that inevitably bred some resentment, along with persistent, half-joking suspicion that millers routinely took more than their fair cut of flour as payment for the grinding, a suspicion old enough and widespread enough across medieval and early modern England to have worked its way into folk tales and popular sayings of its own. Josiah, for his part, maintains that his measures are entirely honest, and Robert, who has known him for years and finds him in fact likeable despite the trade's poor general reputation, tends to believe him. though he admits, with a small private smile, that he has never actually stood over the man's shoulder to check the scales personally. Late in the summer, the Weavers' Guild holds its yearly feast day, a tradition that draws together every master weaver in the town along with their journeymen and apprentices, a mixture of genuine celebration and formal business, since the feast also serves as the occasion when guild accounts are reviewed, new members formally admitted, and any outstanding disputes between members brought to some resolution before the gathered company. It is held this year, as most years, in the largest available space the town can offer, the church's own hall being borrowed for the occasion, with the priest's blessing. Long tables set up and laden with food that every guild member's household has contributed something toward, an impressive spread by the standards of an ordinary working week, meat pies and fresh bread, and a decent quantity of ale, along with, this year, a particularly fine cheese that one of the older weavers has brought specifically to mark the occasion of his own retirement from active practice of the trade, passing his own workshop and remaining commissions onto his eldest son in a small informal ceremony that draws warm applause from the assembled company. Robert stands to speak briefly on Nick's behalf during the more formal portion of the evening, reporting on his apprentice's steady progress to the assembled guild members as custom requires periodically through the 7-year term, and finds himself, rather to his own surprise, praising the boy's work with more genuine warmth than the strictly required formal language demands, describing in some detail a particularly difficult length of patterned cloth Nick had managed nearly independently just weeks earlier, evenness and tension held admirably steady across a piece that had given even some more experienced weavers real trouble in the past. Nick, standing at the edge of the gathering listening to this, ears reddening slightly with a mixture of pride and embarrassment at being discussed so openly, catches Robert's eye briefly across the hall, and something passes between master and apprentice in that small exchange glance that neither of them would ever think to put into words, but which both of them understand completely. Alison's child arrives in the deep quiet hours of a night in early spring, and a birth itself, as nearly all births in this period, takes place entirely within the world of women. Joan present alongside Cecily Marsh, who has attended enough births across the years to be considered something close to the town's informal, unofficial midwife, along with a woman named Grace Pelham, who holds the more formal title of midwife proper, licensed by the church, a requirement that surprises many people when they first learn of it, since midwifery in this period fell under ecclesiastical oversight rather than any medical authority, partly because a midwife was sometimes called upon to perform an emergency baptism on a newborn who seemed unlikely to survive long enough to reach the church itself, a responsibility the church took seriously enough to require formal licensing and a sworn oath. Peter, along with every other man in this world at this moment, has no place in the room where his wife labours, and spends the long hours instead at his own father's house nearby, unable to sleep, unable to settle to any task, pacing in a way that Hugh Wren, having been through this himself twice with Peter's own mother, recognises with a wry, sympathetic patience, sitting up with his son through the small hours and saying, mostly, very little, understanding that there is not much useful to say to a man in this particular state of helpless waiting beyond simple, steady companionship. The labour is long, as first labours very often are, stretching through most of the night, and there are moments, Joan will admit much later, quietly, only to Robert, when real fear moved through the room, the kind of fear that everyone present understood without needing to voice aloud, since childbirth in this period carried genuine risk that no family, however loving, however careful, could entirely protect against. But the fear does not become the story of this particular night. Just as the sky outside has begun its first pale shift toward dawn, a thin new cry finally cuts through the room, and Alison, exhausted beyond anything she had imagined beforehand, finds herself laughing and crying at once as Grace Pelham places a small, furious, entirely healthy daughter into her arms. Word reaches Peter within the hour, carried by a breathless younger cousin sent running the short distance between the two houses, and he is at Alison's side faster than dignity would strictly recommend, arriving still in his nightshirt, hair uncombed, utterly unconcerned with any of it, kneeling by the bed to look at his daughter with an expression that Alison, watching him, thinks she will remember for the rest of her life, something between disbelief and a happiness too large for his face to properly hold. The christening follows within a matter of days rather than weeks, since infant baptism was generally arranged promptly in this period, partly out of straightforward religious conviction about the importance of the sacrament, and partly, unspoken but real, out of an awareness that infant mortality remained quite present enough in this world that families did not want to delay a rite considered so spiritually essential. The baby is named Joan, after her grandmother, a choice that catches the elder Joan entirely by surprise when Alison tells her, and produces for perhaps the first time in this entire story, a moment where Robert's normally composed wife finds herself simply unable to speak for a moment, her eyes bright, one hand pressed briefly to her mouth, before she manages to gather herself enough to properly thank her daughter for an honour she had not remotely expected, and clearly treasures beyond any words she can immediately find. That christening itself, held at the same church where Alison was married not 2 years earlier, draws much of the same wide circle of family and friends and neighbours, godparents chosen from among the couple's closest connections, Cecily Marsh among them, formally taking on a role that in this period carried real ongoing responsibility, a promise to help oversee the child's religious upbringing should anything happen to her parents, not merely the ceremonial, largely symbolic role godparents often occupy today. Little Joan sleeps through most of her own christening, entirely unbothered by the water or the words spoken over her, and the small congregation gathered to witness it finds this, as congregations witnessing exactly this scene always seem to, both very funny and very moving in roughly equal measure. Hal, meanwhile, has been growing steadily older through all of this, 10 now, then 11, tall for his age in a way that surprises Joan every time she stops to actually look at him properly, rather than simply seeing the small boy who still lives, somewhere underneath, in her own memory of him. The question of his own future trade has begun, gradually, to occupy real conversation within the household, since a boy his age needs to be settled into some path fairly soon if he is to begin an apprenticeship at the customary starting age, and Robert, though he would have welcomed the idea of his son eventually taking up weaving in turn readily enough, has been careful, in a way that speaks to the particular thoughtfulness of his own character, not to simply assume this outcome without truly asking what Hal himself wants. What Hal wants, it turns out, when the question is finally put to him directly one evening by the fire, surprises both his parents somewhat. He has spent enough Sundays over the years watching Edward Hollis work at the forge, drawn by the sparks, and the ringing hammer blows the same way he was as a small child, that the fascination has never really faded, as if anything deepened as he has grown old enough to understand more of what the work actually involves, and he asks, tentatively, almost expecting to be told no, whether it might be possible to apprentice with the blacksmith instead of following his father into weaving. Robert takes a moment before answering, not out of disappointment, though there is perhaps a small private flicker of something like wistfulness at the thought of his own trade not continuing directly through his son, but simply out of the natural pause of a father really considering his child's request rather than reacting to it immediately. He tells Hal, eventually, that he thinks it is a fine idea, that a good blacksmith is never short of work in a town like this one, that Edward Hollis is a decent, patient master by every account Robert has ever heard, and that a trade chosen because a boy honestly wants it tends to be practiced with more skill and more satisfaction across a lifetime than a trade simply inherited by default. Joan, listening to this exchange from across the room, finds herself feeling something complicated, pride in her husband's generosity of spirit, mixed with her own quiet realization that her household is, gradually, continuing to change shape around her, children growing and choosing their own paths, in a process that no amount of loving preparation ever quite braces a parent fully for when it actually begins happening in earnest. Edward Hollis, approached formally not long after, agrees readily enough to take Hal on, having known the boy his entire life, and having, if he is honest, rather enjoyed the boy's persistent, wide-eyed fascination with the forge across all these years of Sunday watching. The indenture is drawn up much as Nick's was years earlier, 7 years of formal training ahead of him, and Hal begins his new life at the forge that autumn with an eagerness that Edward finds, in his own gruff way, genuinely touching, the boy arriving early each morning and staying late without complaint, utterly undaunted by the heat and the physical demands of the work that leave him, most evenings for the first several months, aching in muscles he had not previously known he possessed. Robert's own workshop feels different for a while after Hal leaves each morning for the forge, rather than lingering at home, quieter in a way that has nothing to do with actual sound, since Hal was never much involved in the weaving itself anyway, but everything to do with the particular shift a house undergoes each time one more of its children steps fully out into the wider working world. Nick, for his part, is deep into the final stretch of his own apprenticeship now, closing in on his eventual admission as a journeyman weaver in his own right, and Robert finds himself on quiet evenings at the loom with only Nick for company, thinking sometimes about how strange and orderly this whole slow unfolding process actually is, when you step back far enough to see its full shape. Children arriving, growing, choosing, leaving, each departure making room, in its own way, for whatever comes next, the household never quite the same from one year to the next, and yet, somehow, still recognizably, steadily itself throughout all of it. News of the wider world reaches a town like this one slowly, unevenly, and usually second-hand, filtered through whichever traveller happens to pass through with something to report. And it is worth pausing on how this actually worked in practice, since it is so different from anything we experience today, saturated as we are in constant, immediate information from every corner of the globe at once. A peddler comes through perhaps once every few months, a man who travels a wide circuit across several counties carrying small goods, pins and needles and ribbons and the occasional printed pamphlet, and his arrival in town is always something of a minor event, women in particular gathering to see what small treasures he might have in his pack this time, and everyone, regardless of what they intend to buy, eager to hear whatever news he has picked up along his travels. This particular autumn he arrives with word, several weeks old by the time it reaches this far from London, about a new venture some merchants and adventurers have organised to seek a trading route toward the distant east, news that means relatively little in any immediate practical sense to a household like the Baldwins, but which Robert nonetheless finds himself turning over with real curiosity, this being an age, after all, when English ships and English ambitions were reaching steadily further outward across the world's oceans than they ever had before, even if the actual mechanics of that reaching remained, for someone like Robert, something learned about only in these scattered, delayed fragments rather than experienced in any direct way himself. The peddler also carries, this visit, a printed pamphlet describing, in suitably dramatic language, a recent event at the royal court, and though Robert cannot read the whole of it fluently himself, Joan manages well enough between them, sitting by the fire that evening working through it slowly aloud while Robert and Nick listen, the printing itself a small marvel in its own right when you stop to consider it properly, since printed material of any kind would have been essentially unimaginable in England barely a century earlier, before Caxton first brought a printing press to Westminster, and now here it sits, cheaply and quickly produced, carrying court gossip all the way out to a small wool town where a weaver's wife reads it aloud by candlelight to her assembled family. I find something worth sitting with in that image, honestly. The way this new printing technology, still relatively young in the broader sweep of history, was already beginning, this early, this quietly, to do exactly what such technologies always eventually do, closing distances, letting information move faster and further and more cheaply than the old handwritten, hand-copied world had ever allowed, planting the earliest seeds of an interconnectedness that would, centuries later, produce a world where news reaches everyone everywhere within moments rather than weeks. Robert has no way of knowing, sitting there by his own fire listening to his wife read aloud, that he is living through the early, halting beginnings of exactly that kind of transformation. He simply enjoys the story, asks Joan to reread a particularly striking passage a second time, and files the whole thing away as pleasant evening entertainment, which, in the end, is really all it needs to be for him. There is also, this same visit, a small folded map among the peddler's wares, crudely printed but genuine, showing the outline of England and a portion of the surrounding coastline, and Nick examining it with the particular fascination of a young man who has never travelled more than a day's walk from his own birthplace, traces the rough line of coast with one finger, trying to work out roughly where their own town might sit relative to London, relative to the sea itself, which he has never actually seen despite the wool his own hands help produce eventually crossing it. Robert watches him do this with a small private smile, remembering doing much the same thing himself as a younger man. That particular ache of curiosity about a wider world one may very well never personally visit. A feeling that connects Nick, in this quiet moment by the fire, to essentially every curious young person who has ever lived in a small settled place and wondered, briefly, what lies beyond its edges. Nick's own 7 years finally draw to their close the following spring, and the day his formal apprenticeship ends carries a quiet significance that neither he nor Robert makes much outward show of, though both feel it plainly enough underneath their usual composure. There is a small ceremony before the guild, Nick presenting a finished piece of cloth, his masterpiece in the old sense of that word, a length of broadcloth woven entirely by his own hand from start to finish, examined carefully by a panel of established masters who check its evenness, its tension, the consistency of its selvage edges, before formally declaring him fit to practice the trade independently as a journeyman, no longer bound to Robert's household or Robert's authority, free now to work for wages under any master who will employ him, with the eventual, hoped-for prospect of becoming a master himself someday, setting up his own workshop, perhaps even taking on apprentices of his own. Robert feels the boy's departure, when it comes, more than he had quite expected to. The workshop noticeably quieter without Nick's now familiar presence at the second bench, though Nick does not go far, taking work initially with another master weaver elsewhere in town, while he saves toward the eventual goal of independence, and he visits often enough, dropping by of an evening to share a cup of ale and talk over old times, that the separation feels considerably softer in practice than Robert had privately braced himself for. There is a particular satisfaction, Robert finds, in watching a young man he trained walk out into the world and begin, visibly, to build something of his own, a satisfaction that sits alongside and does not at all diminish the small private ache of a workshop grown quieter, both feelings entirely genuine and entirely capable, it turns out, of existing together without contradiction. That winter, the household gathers for Christmas in a configuration that has grown considerably larger than the small family of 5 we first met at the beginning of this story. Alison and Peter arrive with little Joan, now toddling determinedly around the house on legs that have only recently learnt to reliably hold her upright, along with a second child on the way, due sometime in the coming spring, Alison moving now with the particular careful, rolling gait of a woman well into her final months. Hal, apprenticed now for over a year at the forge, arrives with hands already showing the particular calluses and small burn scars that mark a young smith's hands, proud in an understated way of the trade he has chosen, eager to describe, at rather more length than his family strictly requires, the details of a particularly satisfying piece of ironwork he completed just that week. The house fills, for these 12 days, with a warmth that goes considerably beyond the fire's actual physical heat. Generations gathered close in a space that has, somehow, never felt too small for whatever it needed to hold, Robert watching his granddaughter toddle unsteadily toward the hearth's warmth with the particular fierce protective attention that grandparents seem to develop instantly and completely regardless of how relaxed they may have been as actual parents decades earlier. Joan finding herself, more than once through the busy stretch of the season, simply standing still for a moment in the midst of all the noise and activity, taking in the sight of her whole gathered family and feeling something she does not entirely have adequate words for, gratitude perhaps, though the word feels too small and too plain for the actual size of what she is feeling. There is a particular moment, on Christmas Eve itself, that Joan will carry with her for a long time afterward, little Joan asleep at last in Alison's lap by the fire, Hal recounting some story from the forge to a patiently listening Robert, Peter helping Nick, visiting for the evening, with some small repair to a piece of harness leather, the whole scene lit by candlelight and firelight together, the plum pottage simmering its familiar spiced smell through the small house exactly as it has every Christmas Eve for as long as anyone present can remember, and Joan thinks, watching all of it, that whatever else this life has asked of her, whatever hardships and small daily struggles have threaded through it alongside its genuine joys, this particular moment, this exact gathering of people she loves in this exact small warm room, represents something worth every bit of the effort it has taken to arrive at. I mentioned earlier that everyone in the Baldwin household, children included, drinks ale rather than water as their primary daily beverage, and it is worth explaining properly how that ale actually came to exist, since brewing was, like so much else in this world, primarily women's work, and Joan brews it herself roughly every couple of weeks, in a process that takes the better part of a full day and fills the house with a warm, yeasty, slightly sweet smell entirely distinct from bread baking. Though related to it, both processes depending on the same essential transformation worked by yeast on grain. The process begins with malted barley, grain that has been allowed to sprout slightly before being dried, a transformation that converts some of its starches into fermentable sugars, and Joan buys hers already malted from a local maltster rather than managing that particular stage herself, though some households, particularly out in the surrounding countryside, still handle the whole process from raw barley onward. She steeps the malt in hot water in a large wooden tub, a process called mashing, stirring it periodically, and the sweet liquid that results, called wort, gets strained off and boiled, traditionally with hops added for bitterness and, importantly, for their natural preservative qualities, a practice that had become fairly standard across England by this point in the Tudor period, though the older style of unhopped ale, brewed without hops and consequently spoiling much faster, was still known and occasionally preferred by some, particularly older households who considered the newer hopped variety, sometimes still called simply beer to distinguish it from traditional ale, a slightly foreign innovation, hops having originally been introduced to England from the continent. Once boiled, the wort cools and gets combined with yeast, sometimes a bit reserved from a previous batch, sometimes fresh from a neighbour willing to share, and left to ferment for several days in a covered vessel, the whole household keeping a respectful, slightly anxious eye on its progress, since a batch could occasionally spoil or fail to ferment properly, a genuine small household disaster, given how central ale is to daily nourishment and hydration alike. Joan's brewing, over years of practice, has become reliable enough that such failures happen only rarely now, and the small ale she produces for everyday household drinking is deliberately kept weaker, lower in alcohol than the stronger varieties brewed specifically for festivals and celebrations, precisely because it needs to be safely consumable by everyone in the household, Hal included, multiple times a day, without leaving anyone properly intoxicated by their own lunch. The garden behind the house, small as it is, occupies a considerable amount of Joan's attention through the growing months, and it is worth picturing properly rather than simply mentioning in passing, a modest plot perhaps the size of a small modern room, densely planted with a mixture that would look, to modern eyes, considerably more chaotic and intermixed than the tidy, separated rows of a contemporary vegetable garden. Cabbages grow alongside onions grow alongside a patch of peas, trained up simple wooden stakes, and threaded throughout, wherever a bit of space allows, herbs that serve both culinary and medicinal purposes interchangeably, since this period drew far less firm a line between food and medicine than modern thinking generally does, a sprig of rosemary being understood equally as a flavouring for meat and as a remedy believed to strengthen memory and ease headache alike. There is a small hive of bees too, kept in a simple woven straw skep near the garden's edge, tended mostly by Robert rather than Joan, an unusual division of labour that traces back to his own father having kept bees before him, and the honey they produce, harvested carefully in late summer, represents one of the household's only reliable sources of genuine sweetness, since refined sugar remains, at this point in history, an extraordinarily expensive imported luxury, reserved almost entirely for the wealthy, appearing on an ordinary household's table, if at all, only in the smallest, most carefully rationed quantities on the rarest of special occasions. Honey sweetens what needs sweetening through the rest of the year, goes into the wax that, mixed with tallow, sometimes stretches the household's candles a little further and burns a little cleaner than tallow alone, and the beeswax itself, in small quantities, finds its way into a simple homemade salve Joan keeps on hand for chapped hands and minor cuts, mixed with a bit of the garden's own herbs. One more small example of how thoroughly this household's daily survival depended on knowing how to draw multiple, overlapping kinds of value from every single resource available to them. Nothing wasted, nothing used for only one purpose, when a second or third purpose could reasonably be found. The years that follow settle into their own steady, familiar rhythm. the kind that tends to blur pleasantly together in memory, even while each individual day, lived through, feels entirely distinct and present. Alison's second child arrives that spring as expected, a son this time, named Robert after his grandfather, a choice that leaves the elder Robert almost as undone as Joan had been at the earlier naming of little Joan, though he manages, characteristically, to hide most of his emotion behind a gruff clearing of the throat and a hand that lingers just slightly too long on his new grandson's small, sleeping head. Robert's own hands, meanwhile, have begun showing the accumulated toll of decades spent at the loom, a stiffness in the mornings that takes longer to work out than it once did, joints that ache more persistently through the damp winter months than they used to, and though he says little about it, preferring, in the manner of many men of his generation, to simply work through discomfort rather than dwell on it aloud, Joan notices, the way she notices everything about her husband after so many years of shared life, and begins, quietly, without making any particular announcement of it, taking on a slightly larger share of certain physically demanding household tasks that had for years been more evenly divided between them. Nick, several years into his journeyman work now, finally saves enough, combined with a small loan arranged through the guild's own mutual fund, to set up a workshop of his own. A modest establishment, but plainly his, complete with a loom he purchases second-hand from a retiring weaver 2 towns over and has repaired and adjusted to his own satisfaction over several careful weeks. He takes on an apprentice himself that autumn, a boy of 13 from a family Robert knows only slightly, and there is something Robert finds quietly moving in watching this particular cycle turn over, the boy he once trained now standing where he himself once stood, passing along a craft and a trade and, presumably, a good measure of patience to yet another generation, the whole slow chain of skill and knowledge extending itself one careful link further into a future Robert will not personally see the full extent of, but trusts, watching Nick work, is in entirely capable hands. The town itself changes too, slowly, in ways that only become visible if you compare its present shape to how it looked years earlier, rather than trying to notice the change happening day by day. A few new houses have gone up along the lane leading toward the manor, the wool trade having remained steady enough through these years to support a modest but real growth in the town's overall prosperity. The old inn has new ownership, a younger man having taken it over from its previous keeper, who retired to live with his daughter's family in a neighbouring village. Marjorie Fenn, the elderly widow Joan used to send bread to, passed peacefully in her sleep 2 winters back, mourned in fact by a community that had in its own imperfect but real way looked after her through her final years, and her small cottage now houses a young couple newly married, starting their own version of exactly the story we have been following through this whole account. Cecily Marsh's own daughter married the following spring, a match Cecily discussed at length with Joan over many shared walks to the well, the 2 women having, over the decades of their friendship, developed something close to a shared language for exactly this kind of ongoing, overlapping life event, births and marriages, and small crises and quiet daily victories, threading continuously through both households in a way that has bound the 2 families together nearly as tightly as blood relation might have. Joan cannot now easily remember a version of her adult life that did not include Cecily's steady, familiar presence beside her at the well most mornings, and finds herself, on the rare occasions she considers it directly, quite grateful for a friendship that has simply, quietly, always been there, requiring no particular maintenance or effort beyond the ordinary faithfulness of showing up, again and again, across years that have somehow, without either of them quite noticing the accumulation, become an entire shared lifetime. Let me bring you back, for a while now, to a single ordinary evening, chosen from among the many that make up these later years, not because anything remarkable happens within it, but because it is precisely the kind of evening this whole story has been quietly building toward, the accumulated weight of an entire life settled into something calm and steady and deeply, unremarkably good. It is autumn again, the particular autumn evening light slanting low and gold through the small window, catching dust motes that drift slowly through the still air of the workshop where Robert sits at his loom, working at a pace that has slowed somewhat from his younger years, but has not lost any of its accumulated skill, If anything, his hands know this work now, so thoroughly that his mind is free, in a way it rarely was decades earlier, to simply drift while his fingers continue their long-practiced motion, the familiar clack and thud of the beta bar filling the room with a sound so woven into the texture of Robert's own life that he barely registers it as sound anymore, the way you stop hearing your own heartbeat despite it never actually stopping. Joan sits nearby, mending, always mending, though these days the garment in her lap is as likely to belong to a grandchild as to her own immediate household, little Joan having outgrown yet another dress that will, once let out and adjusted, pass down to a younger cousin the same careful, thrifty circulation of clothing that has characterized this household's whole approach to material goods across every year we have followed them through. The fire burns low and steady in the hearth, needing only occasional small attention, and the smell that fills the room, wood smoke and wool and the faint sweetness of a pot of stewed apples Joan has simmering for later, is a smell so completely, thoroughly familiar to both of them that neither could probably describe it accurately to a stranger, having lived inside it so continuously and for so long that it has become, essentially, simply the smell of being home. Outside, the town settles into its own evening rhythm, other households doing precisely this same thing in their own small variations, fires being built up, suppers being prepared, the day's work winding down toward its natural close, and somewhere across the rooftops the church bell marks an hour that neither Robert nor Joan feels any particular need to note precisely, the days remaining light and the natural rhythm of their own bodies serving, as they always have, as guide enough for what remains to be done before rest. There is a particular quality to silence shared between two people who have spent this many years together, a comfortable, wordless companionship that requires no constant conversation to sustain itself, and Robert and Joan sit for long stretches some evenings without speaking at all, each absorbed in their own quiet task, and yet entirely, warmly aware of the other's presence in the room, a closeness that does not need to announce itself through words to be real and complete. Occasionally one of them will offer some small observation, a comment about the coming weather, a question about whether Alison and her family might visit this coming Sunday, and the other will answer, and the conversation will subside again into its own comfortable quiet, the whole evening unfolding at exactly the unhurried pace it wants to unfold at, with nowhere else either of them needs to be, and nothing else either of them particularly needs to be doing. This, I think, is worth sitting with for a moment. This particular texture of an ordinary evening near the end of a long working day, near the end too, in its own way, of a long working life, because it represents something that gets lost, I think, in histories that focus only on the dramatic, the exceptional, the moments that make it into official records. Most of any life, in any century, is made of exactly this: quiet evenings, familiar smells, a fire that needs tending, and a garment that needs mending, and a companion whose presence has become, over enough shared years, less like a separate person and more like an extension of one's own sense of being at home in the world. Robert Baldwin will never appear in any history book. Joan Baldwin's name exists only in a parish register that very few people will ever think to consult. And yet this evening, this exact quality of quiet, contented ordinariness is as real and as complete a human life as any king's or queen's, lived fully within its own small compass, asking nothing more than what it has, across all these years, quietly and steadily received. That Sunday, as it happens, does bring Alison and her family across town for their regular visit. Little Joan, now old enough, at nearly 5, to have developed a whole personality entirely her own, stubborn in a way that makes Alison laugh even while she tries, without much real success, to correct it, curious about every last thing in a way that keeps her grandmother constantly answering questions through the whole visit. Why does the fire need wood? Why do the hens lay eggs? Why does grandfather's loom make that particular sound? An endless stream of inquiry that Joan, remembering her own patience with a very similar Alison at roughly the same age, meets with more genuine delight than exhaustion. Young Robert, not yet 2, mostly occupies himself with determined, wobbling attempts to follow his older sister everywhere she goes, a small shadow trailing her around the workshop with an adoration that Joan and Alison both find endlessly amusing, and Robert the elder finds himself more than once through the afternoon simply setting his shuttle aside to watch his grandchildren with an attention he probably could not have managed or thought to prioritize as intensely during his own busier years actually raising Alison and Hull. There is something about grandparenthood, he has come to think, that grants a particular kind of attention, less anxious, less weighted with the constant practical worry of actual parenting, freer somehow to simply enjoy the small daily miracle of a child's developing personality without the accompanying pressure of needing to shape or correct or worry over every small thing. Hal arrives too this Sunday, no longer the gangly boy who once chased crows through a harvest field, but a young man now, broad through the shoulders from years of forge work, his own courtship. Joan has noticed with quiet interest over recent months, apparently progressing with a blacksmith's daughter from a neighbouring town, a match that would please everyone involved if it comes to fruition, though Hal himself remains characteristically close-mouthed about the details, deflecting his mother's gentle inquiries with the same good-natured evasion he has employed on this particular subject for weeks now. In the late afternoon, with the whole family gathered close around the fire, the way families in this household always seem to gather, Robert finds himself telling the old story again, the one about the fox and the farmer, the same story he told a much younger Hal by this same fire more years ago than he entirely likes to count, and little Joan listens with exactly the same fierce, complete concentration her uncle once brought to the same tale, asking, at the story's end, whether the fox ever came back a fourth time, a question Robert has fielded from enough small listeners over enough years now that he has developed several different satisfying answers depending on his mood, tonight choosing to tell her that the fox did try once more, and this time the farmer, having finally learnt his lesson properly, was ready for him. A small addition to the traditional tale that makes little Joan clap her hands with satisfaction at justice, in her young estimation, having been properly served. Watching this small scene unfold, story passing from grandfather to granddaughter exactly as it once passed from father to son and, before that, from Robert's own father to Robert himself, 3, now 4 generations deep in an unbroken chain of firelit storytelling that none of them have ever thought to remark upon as anything unusual, Joan finds herself struck, not for the first time but perhaps more powerfully than usual on this particular evening, by how much of what actually endures across a family, across a community, across a whole span of centuries, has nothing to do with anything written down or officially recorded, and everything to do with exactly this, a story told by firelight, a particular way of kneading bread, a remedy for fever passed from mother to daughter. Small, unremarkable inheritances that nonetheless carry an entire world forward, one quiet evening at a time. Winter comes around again, as it always does, and on the particular evening I want to leave you with, snow has been falling steadily since mid-afternoon, the first real snow of the season, thick and quiet, settling over the town's rooftops, and softening every hard edge of the familiar streets into something gentler, something that makes even grown adults pause at their windows for a moment, with something close to the same wonder children bring to it so readily. Robert stands briefly at the door, watching it fall in the last grey light before full dark, the flakes catching what little glow escapes from the house behind him, and he thinks, as he often does at this particular threshold moment between outside and in, about how many winters he has now watched arrive in exactly this way, standing in exactly this doorway, and how each one still manages, despite the accumulated repetition, to feel like its own small private miracle. Inside, the fire burns warm and steady, built up a bit higher than usual against the cold pressing in from outside, and the whole house carries that particular deep, settled winter warmth that only a well-tended hearth can produce, a warmth that seems to soak into the very walls and floor rather than simply occupying the air. Joan has candles lit already, several of them, a small extravagance she allows herself on evenings when the snow makes everything outside feel especially dark and close, and their combined glow fills the room with a soft golden light that flickers as it catches on the polished wood of the loom, on the careful stitches of whatever mending currently occupies her lap, on the steam rising gently from a pot of something warm simmering over the fire. There is nowhere else, on an evening like this, that either Robert or Joan would rather be, and nothing pressing enough in the whole wide unseen world beyond their small window to compete, even for a moment, with the simple, complete sufficiency of this particular room, this particular fire, this particular quiet stretch of shared time before sleep. The loom sits idle tonight, work set aside in deference to the weather and the season both, and Robert finds himself instead simply sitting close by the fire beside his wife, watching the snow continue its steady fall past the small high window, listening to the particular hush that snow always brings to a town's usual evening sounds. Dogs quieter, footsteps outside muffled to nothing, the whole world outside seeming to hold its breath under that soft white weight. He thinks, on an evening like this, about the whole long unfolding story this family has lived through together, a wedding that once felt like the most significant event imaginable and has since become simply the beginning of an entire subsequent chapter full of its own weddings and births and quiet daily victories, an apprentice who arrived gangly and uncertain and left, years later, a skilled master craftsman in his own right, a son who found his own calling at another man's forge rather than his father's loom, and has in doing so become exactly the person he was always meant to become. None of it, looked at from any single day within it, felt like it was building toward anything in particular. It simply unfolded, one ordinary day following another, the way any life actually unfolds, whether lived in a small Tudor wool town or in whatever room you yourself are sitting in tonight, listening to these words. And yet, looked at now, from this particular snow-quieted evening, the whole shape of it becomes visible in a way it never quite could while it was actually happening. A life built almost entirely from small, unremarkable, deeply sufficient moments, just like this one, stacked patiently one atop another across enough years to become, eventually, something that feels, from this vantage point, remarkably close to complete. Robert reaches over, without quite thinking about it, and takes Joan's hand, and she looks up from her mending with a small, unsurprised smile, having long since grown entirely used to these small, quiet gestures that need no explanation between two people who have shared this much accumulated time together, and for a while neither of them says anything at all, simply sitting together by the fire while the snow continues falling, steady and soft and endless, outside their small, warm window. I think, before we let this particular evening close fully around itself, it is worth returning briefly to something I mentioned much earlier in this story, that length of broadcloth Robert once sold directly at market, the one that a merchant's agent examined so carefully before finally agreeing on a price neither man found entirely satisfying. We never followed it any further than that market square, and I want to, just briefly, because I think its onward journey says something worth sitting with about the strange invisible threads connecting a life as small and local as Robert Baldwin's to a world considerably larger than he himself will ever personally travel through. The cloth, in all likelihood, made its way by cart toward London within weeks of its sale, joining other bales from other weavers across the region, loaded eventually onto a ship bound for the Low Countries, crossing water that Robert himself has never seen and in all probability never will. In Antwerp, or perhaps Bruges, it would have passed through the hands of dyers and finishers who transformed its plain undyed surface into something considerably richer, dyed some deep colour Robert could only guess at, finished with a texture and sheen his own workshop was never equipped to produce, before being sold onward again, perhaps into a merchant's own stock, perhaps directly to a tailor commissioned to produce a garment for someone whose name and face and entire life Robert will never know anything about. Somewhere, perhaps, a coat made from Robert Baldwin's own careful handwork moves through the streets of a foreign city, worn by someone entirely unaware of the small English wool town where its raw material first took shape under one weaver's patient hands, entirely unaware of the particular quality of morning light that fell across that workshop the day this exact length of cloth came off the loom, entirely unaware, in fact, that Robert Baldwin ever existed at all. And this does not strike me, thinking about it, as sad, though it might sound that way described plainly like this. It strikes me instead as something close to wonderful, this quiet, invisible web of connection that an ordinary working life weaves outward into a world it will never fully see, threads reaching further than any single person could ever personally trace, mattering, in small accumulated ways, to people who will never know the particular hands that first set them in motion. This, I think, is worth remembering about history generally, and it is part of why I find myself drawn, again and again, to stories like this one, rather than to the more familiar accounts of kings and battles and great political upheavals that tend to dominate our inherited sense of the past. Robert Baldwin will never appear in any record beyond a parish register listing his baptism, his marriage, and eventually, though not within the span of this particular story, his death. Joan Baldwin's name exists in exactly the same thin official trace, and yet the actual texture of their lives, the fire built each morning, the loom worked each day, the children raised and married and watched, in turn raising their own, the countless small daily kindnesses exchanged with neighbours across decades of shared proximity, all of it represents something considerably closer to what history, at its actual human scale, was really made of than any single royal proclamation or court intrigue ever could. Millions of lives just like this one, unrecorded, unremarkable by any official measure, nonetheless built the entire visible and invisible structure of the world Robert's grandchildren will inherit, and the world their own grandchildren will inherit after them. Cloth woven and shipped and worn, bread baked and shared, children raised with patience and occasional exasperation, and underneath both, a deep abiding love that needed no historical record to be entirely, completely real. I find something genuinely comforting in that thought, something worth carrying with you as your own particular evening winds down toward whatever rest is waiting for you. Your own ordinary days, whatever they contain, however unremarkable they might feel from the inside while you are living through them, are made of exactly this same essential material and matter in ways you may never fully see or measure, considerably more than the parish register of any official record could ever adequately capture. Let me take you, finally, to one more morning before we close this particular story, a spring morning that echoes, in its shape if not its exact details, the very first morning we spent together in this small Suffolk wool town, back when Robert was younger, and Nick still gangly and uncertain, and Alison had not yet noticed the tanner's son at all. The bread, wherever it is being baked this particular morning, still goes in before first light, that rhythm having outlasted every individual change this story has moved through. The hens still need checking before the fox does. The fire still needs coaxing back from its overnight embers, though it is Alison's own hands managing that particular task in her own small household these days, as often as Joan's, the whole cycle continuing to turn, generation folding gently into generation the way it always has, and presumably always will. Robert wakes a little more slowly than he once did, his joints requiring a few extra minutes each morning to loosen properly before he feels ready to face the day's work. But he still rises, still dresses, still makes his way down to the loom that has occupied this same corner of this same house for the better part of his entire adult life. The cloth he weaves now moves a little slower off the loom than it once did, but it moves, steady and reliable, and there is a young man learning the trade alongside him again these days, a nephew of Nick's own wife, sent to Robert for training as a kind of favour between two families whose lives have become, over the years, thoroughly and warmly intertwined, and Robert finds himself teaching this new boy, drawing on patience and clarity he has spent decades accumulating. A far better teacher now, he suspects, than he was in those first uncertain months with young Nick all those years ago. Joan moves through her own morning with the same essential rhythm too. Water fetched, fire tended, bread and pottage prepared, though her own daughter now shares a good portion of this labour across their two households, the two women's days woven together as closely as any length of cloth Robert has ever produced, meeting at the well most mornings still, exchanging news, exchanging small kindnesses, the friendship between Joan and Cecily Marsh having by now expanded to include a whole second generation of daughters and daughters-in-law who have taken up, almost without anyone formally arranging it, exactly the same easy, sustaining pattern of daily mutual support their mothers established decades earlier. The market still gathers on its appointed days. The church bell still calls the town together each Sunday. The seasons still turn through shearing and haymaking and harvest, and the long quiet stretch of winter before spring's return. Each cycle slightly different in its particulars, a wetter summer here, an especially hard winter there, a particularly good harvest that fills everyone with genuine relief, and yet each cycle, too, unmistakably the same essential shape, the same essential rhythm that has carried this small community forward across more years than any single person within it could fully account for. There is something I think really worth holding on to in this particular quality of continuity, this sense that an ordinary life, however small its individual compass, connects backward through countless generations of essentially identical mornings and forward through countless generations yet to come, each one facing its own small version of exactly what Robert and Joan faced: love found and chosen, children raised and released into their own lives, work done with whatever skill and patience a person can bring to it, community sustained through small daily acts of shared attention and care. Robert Baldwin's particular morning, this particular spring, will end eventually the way every morning eventually ends, folding into afternoon, into evening, into the deep settled sleep that a full day's honest work has always earned him. And somewhere, in whatever direction you happen to be reading this from, your own morning or evening or whatever hour has found you listening to these words, carries within it exactly the same essential shape, the same essential worth, whether or not anyone beyond your own small circle will ever think to record it. Let us end then where a story built for sleep probably always should end, with the town itself settling into full night, one house at a time, the way it has done every single evening across every single year we have followed through in this account. Robert and Joan bank their fire together one more time, the same careful, practiced motion repeated now across so many thousands of evenings that neither of them could begin to count them. Ash drawn carefully over the last glowing embers, enough warmth preserved to greet the morning without requiring flint and steel to summon a new flame from nothing. Across town, Alison's own household goes through much the same closing ritual. Peter checking the tannery's gates one final time before joining his wife and children for the night. Little Joan long since asleep. Young Robert curled against his sister in the particular boneless, complete surrender to sleep that only very young children ever quite manage anymore, once the world's daily worries have accumulated enough to interfere with adult rest. Hal, in his own small rented room near the forge these days, saving steadily toward his own eventual household, sleeps the deep, dreamless sleep of a young man whose body has been thoroughly and honestly worked through an entire day's demanding labor. Nick's own house, further across town, holds its own small quiet family now, his wife and their 2 young children settled for the night, his own apprentice, the latest link in this long chain, sleeping in the small loft space that Nick himself remembers occupying, in Robert's own house, what feels now like an entire lifetime ago, and also, somehow, like no time at all. Edward Hollis's forge stands cold and dark for the night, its fire, unlike a household hearth, needing no careful overnight preservation, simply allowed to die out completely each evening and be rebuilt fresh each morning, a different rhythm entirely from the household fires that must never be allowed to fully extinguish. The church stands dark and silent at the center of it all, its tower a familiar shape against a sky now thick with stars, in a way that would astonish anyone accustomed to the light-polluted skies of a modern city, no streetlight anywhere for many miles in any direction to compete with that ancient, undiluted brightness overhead. The river continues its steady, indifferent movement past the fulling mills, now silent hammers, past the tannery's quiet vats, past the mill wheel standing motionless until Josiah Hart sets it turning again with tomorrow's first grain. Somewhere out past the last houses, an owl calls, the same owl perhaps, or its descendant, that called on that very first night we spent together in this story, the sound carrying clear and unbothered across fields that have grown and been harvested and grown again more times than anyone currently sleeping in this town could properly number. Every fire in every house, one by one across the evening, has been banked or allowed to fall, every family gathered in for the night behind their own small door, every ordinary daily labour set aside until morning cools it forward again. This is what an entire life, lived at this particular human scale, actually looks like from just slightly above it. Hundreds of small households, each one containing its own complete world of love and worry and daily labour and quiet accumulated joy, all of them settling, together, into the same deep shared darkness, trusting, the way people have always had to trust, that morning will indeed come again, that the fire's careful embers will indeed catch when coaxed, that whatever tomorrow asks of them will be, in whatever measure life ever actually allows, entirely manageable, one more ordinary day layered gently onto all the ordinary days that came before it. Before we return to that final quiet evening, let me linger a while longer on something we have touched only briefly across this whole account, the actual texture of what an ordinary family like the Baldwins ate across a typical week, because food, more than almost anything else, tends to be the detail that makes a distant century feel suddenly, vividly present rather than abstract. Breakfast, as I mentioned early on, was pottage, but it is worth understanding just how central grain was to nearly every meal this household ate across the entire year, bread and pottage together supplying the overwhelming majority of daily calories for a family at this social level, supplemented by whatever vegetables the garden could provide, whatever small amount of dairy a family without its own cow might trade or purchase locally, and meat or fish only occasionally, as an addition rather than a centerpiece. Cheese appeared often, being relatively affordable and keeping well without refrigeration, and eggs, when the hens were laying well, provided a reliable, easily prepared source of protein that required none of the careful preservation meat demanded. Vegetables followed the season closely, cabbage and onions and leeks through much of the year, peas and beans fresh in summer and dried for winter storage, root vegetables, turnips and parsnips especially, providing something that would keep reasonably well through the colder months when little else could be freshly harvested. Fruit appeared mostly in season, apples from the household's own small tree, occasionally berries gathered from hedgerows in late summer, and very little of any of it wasted. Windfall apples too bruised for eating fresh going instead into preserves or the household's own small batch of cider when the harvest allowed for it. Herbs, as I mentioned, served double duty throughout, flavouring what might otherwise have been fairly plain, repetitive fare, and Joan's particular skill with seasoning, a pinch of this dried herb, a careful addition of that one, has become, over years of practice, something close to a genuine culinary art, even if she would never think to describe her own cooking in such elevated terms. A simple pottage, in her hands, carries real depth of flavour that a less careful cook might never manage from the same humble base ingredients, and her family, without ever quite articulating why, has always noticed and appreciated the particular care she brings to even the most ordinary daily meal. Sundays, and feast days more broadly, brought the real variation to this otherwise fairly steady weekly rhythm, meat appearing more generously, a wider variety of dishes prepared than the working week's usual efficient simplicity allowed, and it is worth remembering, thinking about this pattern, how thoroughly the entire rhythm of eating in this period was shaped by religious calendar as much as by simple availability, certain days requiring abstinence from meat, certain seasons, Lent especially, imposing a much stricter, more limited diet across the whole community for a sustained stretch of weeks each spring, a shared discipline that every household, rich and poor alike, observed together, creating a kind of collective seasonal rhythm to eating that modern life, with its year-round availability of essentially anything a person might want to eat at any time, has largely lost entirely. I find something worth noticing in that loss, actually, thinking about it now. There was a structure to eating in this world, an anticipation built into it, a fresh strawberry meaning something rather more, arriving as it did only briefly each summer after a long stretch without any fresh fruit at all, than the same strawberry means to someone today who can find one in a supermarket in the middle of winter, flown in from some distant hemisphere, available so constantly that its arrival carries no particular anticipation or gratitude at all. Joan Baldwin's first taste of the season's earliest peas, gathered fresh from her own small garden after a long winter of dried stores, was, in its own quiet way, a small genuine pleasure that modern abundance, for all its obvious advantages, has made considerably harder for most of us to access anymore. The specific sweetness of scarcity finally, briefly, satisfied. There is one more thread worth pulling on before we let this story settle fully into its rest, and that is the question of who, exactly, kept a town like this one actually running day to day, beyond the manor's more distant lordship and the church's spiritual oversight, Because the answer reveals something honestly interesting about how much ordinary self-governance existed at this local level, considerably more than popular imagination sometimes credits to a period often assumed to have been entirely governed from above by distant, unaccountable authority. The parish itself, beyond its purely religious function, served as the basic administrative unit for an enormous amount of practical local governance throughout this period, and its officers, drawn each year from among the town's more established residents, took on responsibilities that would surprise many people who assumed Tudor local government was simply imposed from London or from the manor house without any meaningful local participation. Church wardens, elected annually, managed the physical upkeep of the church building itself, its roof, its bells, its furnishings, funded through a combination of church rates levied on the parish and whatever additional fundraising the wardens managed to organise across the year. Overseers of the poor, as mentioned earlier, administered the parish's relief obligations. Constables, chosen by rotation among the town's householders, a duty that fell, unpaid, to ordinary men like Robert himself roughly once every several years, handled basic law enforcement, keeping the peace at markets and festivals, bringing minor offenders before the appropriate court, a responsibility Robert served his own required term at some years back, an experience he still occasionally references with a certain wry humour about the particular challenge of trying to calm two drunk and quarrelsome farmhands at a fair without actually striking either of them. This whole system depended, fundamentally, on ordinary townspeople taking direct, hands-on responsibility for their own community's functioning, a form of participatory local governance that operated almost entirely without pay, sustained instead by a shared, largely unquestioned sense of civic obligation, the understanding that a functioning town required its residents to take active turns actually running it rather than simply waiting for some distant authority to manage everything on their behalf. Robert has grumbled, over the years, about more than one unpaid civic duty that has fallen to him in his turn, the particular tedium of a long parish meeting about a disputed boundary hedge, the genuine inconvenience of losing several days' weaving time to his term as constable, but he has never once seriously questioned whether the obligation itself was legitimate, having grown up entirely within a world that simply assumed a town's residents owed this kind of direct, personal contribution to its ongoing functioning. The manor courts I mentioned earlier operated alongside this parish structure, handling matters more directly tied to landholding and tenancy, boundary disputes, questions of inheritance for tenant land, complaints about damage caused by straying livestock, and Robert has served on the jury for several of these sessions over the years, a body of local men called upon to help render judgment on their own neighbours' disagreements, a system that required, and generally received, a genuine commitment to fairness even when the parties involved were people the jurors knew personally, sometimes people they were closely related to or did regular business with, a tension that Robert has watched play out more than once, watched neighbours set aside considerable personal feeling in order to render what they actually believed was a fair judgment, an achievement of ordinary civic character that deserves, I think, rather more credit than it usually receives. Above all of this sat the more distant machinery of royal and county government, sheriffs and justices of the peace drawn from the gentry, ultimately answerable to the crown itself. But for the actual daily texture of life in a town like this one, it was this closer, more local layer of self-governance, parish officers and manor courts and juries, drawn from among one's own neighbours, that shaped the practical experience of order and community accountability far more directly and far more constantly than anything happening at court ever did. It is, I think, a useful corrective to remember when picturing this period, how much genuine local agency and mutual obligation actually structured ordinary people's lives, rather than imagining a population simply subject to arbitrary distant rule, with no meaningful say in how their own immediate community actually functioned day to day. Let me offer one more small, quiet detail before we finally let this story rest. Something about childhood in this world that I find myself properly fond of, which is the sheer, resourceful inventiveness children brought to play in an age with essentially none of the manufactured toys we would recognise today. Hal, back when he was still small enough to be underfoot rather than off learning his trade at the forge, owned almost nothing that a modern child would recognise as a toy in the commercial sense, and yet he was never, in any of the years we have followed this family, particularly short of things to occupy himself with. A hoop, made simply from a bent willow branch, could be rolled and chased down the lane for the better part of an entire afternoon. Guided along with a short stick, races organised informally among whichever other children happened to be out and about at the same time. Knucklebones, small bones from a sheep or pig, cleaned and saved specifically for the purpose, provided the raw material for a whole family of games involving tossing and catching that occupied children across an enormous span of English history. Games that Alison, in her own turn, played with just as much enthusiasm as Hal did, gathered with other girls her age on a doorstep or a patch of grass, the rules passed down and slightly modified from one generation of children to the next without ever being formally written down anywhere. Or take a simple ball, stuffed tightly with rags, or stuffed with a bit of dried moss, and covered in a scrap of leather that Peter's own father might have provided from the tannery's offcuts, could occupy an entire group of children for hours, kicked and thrown and chased across whatever open ground the town offered. String, wound and looped between fingers, produced an endless variety of cat's cradle patterns that Joan herself remembers learning from her own mother and eventually teaching to Alison in turn, a small quiet skill passed down entirely through demonstration and patient repetition, no book or diagram involved at any point in its transmission. What strikes me most, thinking about this particular corner of the story, is how much genuine creativity and social skill this kind of unstructured, mostly unsupervised play actually demanded and developed. Children negotiating their own rules, settling their own disputes, inventing variations and elaborations on inherited games with a freedom that came directly from adults having neither the time nor the inclination to organize or oversee most of it closely. Hal learned, chasing his hoop down the lane or organising an impromptu game of football on the common with a dozen other boys his age, exactly the same fundamental lessons about fairness and cooperation and resilient good humour in the face of losing that any child anywhere has always needed to learn, delivered not through any deliberate adult instruction, but simply through the accumulated experience of hours and hours of plainly free play, a kind of childhood education that asked for nothing more elaborate than a bit of open ground, a willing group of playmates, and whatever simple, homemade object happened to be at hand that particular afternoon. We have travelled a fair distance now, across several years of one small family's ordinary life, through weddings and births, and the slow accumulation of children into adults and adults into grandparents, through markets and church services, and the long steady rhythm of a wool trade that connected this small Suffolk town to a whole distant world beyond anything its residents would ever personally see. And if there is one thing I hope has come through clearly across all of it, it is simply this, that an ordinary life, examined closely enough and patiently enough, turns out to contain within it essentially everything that actually matters: love found and nurtured, work done with care and pride, community sustained through countless small acts of mutual attention, children raised and released with as much wisdom as any set of parents can manage to gather across the always imperfect, always sufficient process of raising them. Robert Baldwin never became wealthy, never held any position of particular distinction beyond his own guild and his own occasional turn as parish constable, never travelled further from his own birthplace than a market town a day's walk away, and yet, examined properly, his life was full in every sense that actually matters, full of skill patiently developed and passed onward, full of love steadily given and steadily received, full of a community that held him and that he in turn helped hold together across decades of shared proximity and mutual obligation. This is not, I think, a small achievement, however quietly and unremarkably it unfolded across the years we have spent following it. It is in fact very close to the largest achievement any human life can actually claim, regardless of century, regardless of circumstance, the simple, difficult, endlessly worthwhile work of loving well and living honestly within whatever particular corner of the world one happens to find oneself placed. The wheel of the seasons that carried Robert and Joan through this whole story, shearing into haymaking, into harvest, into the long quiet stretch of winter, and then, faithfully, back around again into spring, continues turning still, in whatever version of this town's history, followed the particular stretch of years we have spent together tonight. Generations folding into generations, the way water folds endlessly, patiently, into whatever shape the land eventually asks of it. And somewhere in that turning wheel, this particular evening, this particular gathering of a family we have come to know across several hours of shared storytelling, takes its own small, complete, sufficient place. One more turn of a wheel that has been turning for longer than any single life can properly measure, and will, in all likelihood, keep turning long after every name mentioned in this story has faded entirely from any record at all. And so we leave them there, Robert and Joan asleep in the same small house that has held this entire story from its very first morning, their children settled into households of their own scattered across the same familiar streets, their grandchildren dreaming whatever small dreams still visit a mind young enough to hold nothing but the day's simple pleasures and small frustrations. The loom sits quiet in its corner until morning. The hens roost undisturbed. The wool, somewhere in its long journey from chalk downland pasture to a foreign merchant's warehouse, continues its own patient transformation, cloth into colour, thread into garment, one small English town's careful daily labour quietly, invisibly clothing a world it will never personally see. None of this, I think, needs any grander conclusion than the one it has already given itself. There was no great crisis in this story, no battle, no plague, no dramatic reversal of fortune, only a family living across enough years to watch children become parents in their own turn, exactly the kind of life that made up the overwhelming majority of human experience across the entire span we now call the Tudor period, a life built from bread and thread and firelight, from small daily kindnesses exchanged at a well or a churchyard, from love expressed less often in grand declaration than in a hand reached for by the fire, in a story told again to a new small listener, in bread pressed into a growing boy's hands without either party pausing to remark on the kindness of it. If you are still with me now, and I hope you are, though I understand entirely if sleep has already claimed you somewhere back around the wedding, or the birth, or that quiet snow-filled evening by the fire, I want to thank you genuinely for spending this stretch of your own evening here with me, in this small imagined corner of 16th century Suffolk that has, I hope, felt real enough, warm enough, to carry you gently toward whatever rest you came here looking for tonight. There is nothing more this story needs from you now, no more names to remember, no more threads left dangling that require your continued attention, no reveal waiting somewhere further ahead that you might feel compelled to stay awake for. Everything that needed to happen in Robert and Joan Baldwin's small, complete life has already happened, is happening still, in its own quiet way, in the particular kind of continuous present that a story like this one settles into once its central drama, such as it was, has resolved itself into ordinary, sustaining rhythm. Let your own thoughts loosen now, the way Robert's own mind loosens each evening once the loom falls quiet and the fire has been banked for the night. You do not need to hold on to anything from this story specifically. Let the details drift, the way details always drift towards sleep. The exact shape of the wattle and daub walls, the particular smell of tallow smoke and warming wool, the sound the shuttle makes passing back and forth, through threads pulled taut and patient across an old oak frame. None of it needs to stay sharp and present in your mind. It has done its work if it has simply carried you this far, this close to your own rest, this far from whatever thoughts were keeping you company before these words began. Somewhere, whether in an old Suffolk wool town half a millennium gone, or in whatever room actually surrounds you right now, a fire is settling into its embers, a house is going quiet, and the people within it, however imagined, however real, are finally, gratefully, letting the day go. Let yours go too. There is nothing left to finish tonight, nothing left to solve, or plan, or worry over until whatever hour eventually calls you back into wakefulness. The bread will still need baking tomorrow, wherever and whenever tomorrow happens to find you, and it will get baked the way it always somehow does, without your needing to hold that thought any longer than it takes to simply release it now, gently, into the quiet dark around you. Sleep well. I will be here again, with another quiet corner of history, another small ordinary life worth spending an evening inside of, whenever you next find yourself looking for something gentle to carry you through the dark. Until then, rest easy, wherever you are tonight, in whatever room finally holds you, the way this small remembered town has, for a little while now, held you too.